Wow, swagmen and swagettes, just wow. I am very excited to share this conversation with you. I don't always put out a 3-hour episode. The last time I did was with legendary short seller Marc Cohodes, and that has been my most popular episode to date. Funnily enough, Marc Cohodes inspired parts of the career of and is friends with our guest in this episode. You've heard our guest on this podcast before, and you may have heard about him elsewhere. Billionaire Bill Ackman once called him certifiably crazy. Malcolm Turnbull gave him over $1 million to invest. Netflix starred him in the Dirty Money series for his work shorting fraud Valeant Pharmaceuticals. He refers to himself as an eccentric, but I call him idiosyncratically brilliant. Our guest is Australia's fraud-busting, beach-biting short seller, John Hempton. John is the founder and chief investment officer of Bronte Capital, an Australian-based hedge fund. In 2018, a year which ended with carnage for many hedge funds around the world, Bronte posted a 20.2% return after fees. John is an absolute legend in my books, and this time round we go into his background and how he developed his techniques in the dark arts of short selling. I'm not going to say any more about him because we cover so much in the conversation you're about to hear. But before I throw to that conversation, a quick piece of news from me. I was recently approached by a sponsor to advertise on the podcast. As you guys know, there hasn't been any advertising on this show for a long time. All the content is free. I don't put anything behind premium paywalls. And it was a very, let's say, enticing offer. The show, while it's still quote-unquote undiscovered to an extent, has a large enough audience where it could make some serious money from adverts. And it was a very tough decision. Ultimately, I turned the sponsor down because it wasn't something, well, the product wasn't something I truly believe in. Without naming the company, who were very nice to me throughout the negotiations, the product is summaries of non-fiction books, which you can read in a very short period of time. And as I wrestled with it, I thought, if a non-fiction book is truly worth reading, you should go to the primary source, that is the book itself, without intermediation, and read it in all of its nuance and detail. And if it is being intermediated to you, that should be by a subject matter expert at least. So that's why it felt a bit icky going with this sponsor. The reason I tell you this story, while I don't share much about the operational details behind the podcast, is because I want you to know how seriously I take this and how much I value your time. This isn't some side hustle, and the conversations will always be the most important thing about this show. So I turned a big sponsor down. It never feels good turning money down, and I want to vent about it, which I've just done. So thank you for indulging me, and thank you for letting me share that story. But without much further ado, let's throw to this fantastic conversation with John Hempton. Enjoy. John Hempton, thanks for joining me.
I'm glad to be here.
I, after the last time we met, sent a message to Marc Cohodes and said that I thought you were one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he wrote back, "Ha, known him forever. He's a talker."
That's funny because Marc is also one of the smartest people I know, but Marc is a funny guy. Marc is my model on how to pick stocks and my model on how not to run a portfolio.
Yeah.
He is so good. Almost everything Marc touches turns to shit, which is actually the highest compliment you can give a short seller. But it's almost everything. And that's a problem because Marc is all in all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And Marc, for instance, was short one of my favorite shorts, stamps.com. And he was shorted at $100 on the way up. And he's still shorted at $100 on the way down. And in fact, he's still down money, though not very much money. Yeah. And the reason is as it goes up, his position became bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually he had to cry uncle and cover some of it. So he covered some, and then it went down again. It's down below where he started, but he still hasn't made any money.
Yeah.
If he'd taken a tiny position, he would never make as much money in the end, but he wouldn't be down now. And my guess is that the risk-weighted return would be better if you were as good at selecting stocks as Mark and as conservative as my business partner, Simon.
The abominable no man.
Right. Simon's job is to tone down my enthusiasms. And he's very good at that. Right. And in some sense, as you do this game for longer and longer, you realise that a lot of the game is stock selection, but a lot more of the game is portfolio management. And if you look at Marc Cohodes, his stock selection is fantastic and his portfolio management, less so. If you look at, my old boss, Kerr Neilson, who's a truly great stock picker, but his stock selection isn't as good as Marc Cohodes. His results are an awful lot better. Right? And I think the reason his results are an awful lot better is straight out portfolio management. It's like somewhere along the line I decided that what I really wanted to do was pick shorts like Mark, manage a portfolio like Kerr. And I don't think I'm as good at either of those things as those people. I don't think I'm as good at stock picking as Mark, and I don't think I'm as good at portfolio management as some other people. But in fact, the combined result is actually really quite nice, and we're very happy with it. Right? But portfolio management and position sizing turns out to be for keeps. And retail investors, and I figure a lot of the audience here is retail investors, they're very into the stock selection and they're not so good at the latter. And it's a dull conversation, but it's one we should have one day.
Yeah, we'll come back to this. But first, I just want to help situate you for our listeners. And that means going a little bit into your background, which is probably not the most enjoyable thing for you, but we'll touch on a few salient moments. And I actually want to begin with Adelaide, because that's where you grew up.
No, I didn't grow up in
You
Adelaide.
didn't grow up in
I grew
Adelaide?
up in Sydney. I chased a supervisor to Adelaide and went to Adelaide University and had the old guy, JJ Pincus, who was the head of school in Adelaide, as my supervisor for honours. And it was actually a ridiculous honour working for him. JJ was, I guess, one of the three smartest people I've ever managed to work for. Right? But JJ had written a grand total of like 6 economic papers to be a professor. Every one of his co-authors was a Nobel Prize winner. It just seemed to be that he managed to write really good stuff with really good people, and at a rate of about one paper every 5 years.
So this guy was your economics professor at Adelaide University?
Yeah, he supervised my honours thesis.
Okay.
And I'd walk over glass for JJ in those days.
Why did you decide to study in Adelaide if you grew up in Sydney? JJ. Okay.
Simple as that.
Well, how did you first meet this guy?
Well, I did the first 3 years at ANU, and I saw him at the conference, give a talk, and I thought, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
I chased him to Adelaide. So my undergrad is ANU, but the degree actually says Adelaide because that's where I got the honours degree. It's a little illusion. I only lived in Adelaide for a year. It's a good place, though.
Yeah, I liked it.
Not particularly exciting on a Thursday night.
No, not like Canberra.
Well, actually, Canberra was better.
So you would have gone to Mooseheads back in the day?
No. But mostly it's because I did a lot of hiking, and Canberra's like the world's best place to do some hiking from, and Adelaide just isn't. Adelaide is 300 kilometres of wheat farms before you get anywhere interesting.
Yeah.
Did a lot of climbing when I was in Adelaide because it was 4 hours to Arapiles and 4.5 hours to Wilpena Pound. And there's a whole lot of rock climbing at Wilpena Pound, and Arapiles is just wonderful.
Now, the next smartest person you worked for
Was Ken Henry.
Tell me about that.
Look, Ken, I worked in tax policy division of the Treasury, and tax policy has got this ability to become ridiculously technical very fast. And the question is, can you deal with the technical and see the big picture at the same time? And Ken could. And Ken also worked out that I was very good at some of the technical stuff. So I became this expert on tax avoidance. And tax avoidance is like the world's best accounting training, right? And the reason it's the world's best accounting training is that you get a whole lot of documents which might or might not contain a tax avoidance scheme. And nobody is going to tell you how they work. There's a jet flying here, depreciation taken in 2 countries because the plane is partly owned in 2 countries. There's a leverage structure because the plane is financed. There happens to be a boat in this structure as well, just for good measure. Now, these are really good things because the ownership of them is not very clear and their jurisdiction is not very clear. If you have a tractor, the tractor works in Australia, it should be owned in Australia, it should be depreciated in Australia. If you have a plane, if you're not very careful, the income will be earned in a tax haven and the depreciation will be earned in Australia. And there were structures put together by investment bankers in Sydney that achieved roughly that. But nobody was going to tell you how those structures worked. And the ATO would come to us with a bunch of documents, often names redacted, right, found on some subpoena, and they'd say to the Treasury, yeah, there's a giant tax avoidance scheme in here and we need a legislative solution. And Ken sort of nurtured me through the process of learning how to do that. And it turns out a lot of the time if you say, the gap income is 50 million and the taxable income is 50,000. The tax office naturally assumes that it's not getting tax on 50 million. And the truth might be, well, the gap income is fake. Right? And if the gap income is fake, right, then why are they doing that? Well, to fool the stock market. And the most famous example, of course, is that Allen Bond in its Bond Corp in the penultimate year of being listed before it went broke made $400 million profit and paid $750,000 in tax. And there was story after story after story in the Sydney Morning Herald and probably in The Age about how, Bond Corp was earning all this money and not paying any tax. And every one of those stories, every single one of them was false. The truth was that Bond Corp wasn't earning any money. Right? Tax it, you say $400 million income? I don't see any income. Right? And that turned out to be the ways that those, quote, tax avoidance schemes worked, turned out to be one of the great revelations in my life because I learned how you fake your income.
Right.
And that tended to stand me in good stead later as a short seller.
Now, while you were working at the ATO, you were doing...
Well, I wasn't at the ATO, I was at the Treasury.
Sorry, at the Treasury.
There's a status Canberra thing going on
Yeah.
here. You see, the ATO is a line department and the Treasury is a policy department. I got to write cabinet minutes and meeting notes, and I actually got to watch the decision-making process. In some sense, I got to watch how the sausage was being made. Now, the truth is, of course, that legislation and sausages are 2 things that you shouldn't see being made. But it was still interesting.
Yeah. So Treasury, sorry. That was a tip of the slung.
No. But you see, even 20-something years after I left the public service, I have that little public service hierarchy left in me. Right? You work at the tax office? Ugh. You work at the Treasury? Oh, tell me about your job. Right? And I mean, there are equivalent status piles, like the people at the Department of Foreign Affairs all think that they're better than everybody else. Right? And it's really hard to get into, right? Because you're going to travel the world and meet interesting people.
It's sexy.
It's sexy.
Yeah.
Right? But Treasury is also very hard to get into. In my day, it was genuinely a quality department, and the quality was led by some really high-quality people. But, Ted Evans, who was the secretary in those days, was a pretty grand man, and Ken was just a genius.
So while you were working at Treasury, you were doing some trading on the side.
Yeah, well, I met a girl at those days. There's always a girl in there, right? I met a girl in those days that had inherited some money in the US. Not a lot of money, but enough that you'd want to think seriously about how it was managed, or in this case, mismanaged. And so I sort of got interested in trying to work out how to manage it better. And as a result, I also started trading my own money on the side. And it's fair to say that genius is a bull market. The stock market went up, the Australian stock market went up every single year I was at the Treasury. This is, of course, due to the fantastic economic policies that I was pushing, right? But nonetheless, the stock market went up every single year, and my returns were very solidly double-digit. And they weren't double-digit by a little bit; they were double-digit by a lot. And to be entirely honest about it, I was a complete stark raving idiot. Now, fortunately, I think I worked out that I was an idiot by about 1999. And if I hadn't worked out that I was an idiot by 1999, 2000, and the denouement would have told me that. But in fact, I was quite well positioned. But you can very easily fool yourself into believing you're smarter than you are by a bull market. And the only thing that really saved me was that I started reading economic history books and stock market history books. And there's a bookshelf in this office which has 100 of them on the shelf. You don't have to read all 100, right? If you read all 100, you'll wind up a pessimistic bear like me, always waiting for the next crash. But you do need to read 5.
What are they?
It actually doesn't really matter which
okay,
5,
right.
right? You just need to know that things have a history of blowing up. Mm-hmm. So, I could throw a few at you, but it's choose your own. My pet favourite is one that's out of print at the moment, and I lent my copy to someone and haven't got it back.
Always happens.
Right, which is called The Money Miners by Trevor Sykes. And it's a book about the 1967 to 69 nickel boom in Australia, which is a particularly obscure subject, but it's also these days known as the Poseidon boom, because Poseidon went from 2 cents to $250 before it went bankrupt.
This was one of Australia's 3 asset price bubbles, the first being the Melbourne land bubble.
Right. There have been more than that, but they're the really big ones.
Yeah, according to John Simon of the RBA.
Yeah, they're the really big ones.
The big ones.
Now, The Money Miners has a little line in the middle of it. It's describing the most wild-ass boom you could ever imagine, something that made the .com, right? And people who go out scratching for nickel and know nothing about geology getting stupidly rich. And they're getting stupidly rich, of course, off selling stocks. But, it looks like their deposit is 1/4% nickel. Well, 1/4% nickel ain't mineable. You got to crush a lot of rock to get a little bit of nickel, right? But these are really exciting times. And in the middle of it, there's a sentence. It's about 60% of the way through the book, and says, "Did somebody ring a bell?" And of course, nobody did, right? And Trevor Sykes points out that that's the exact top. And from here on in, it's down. And what's really interesting is that 20 pages after somebody rang a bell, or didn't ring a bell, are just like the 20 pages before. They're completely crazy, wild-ass booms. It's just the direction from here on is down. And 2 months later, it was down 20%, but it still looked like it was a wild-ass boom. And yeah, it all collapsed in the end. There are other books. Once in Golconda is particularly good fun.
Never heard of it.
There's another book by the same author, I think, called The Go-Go Years, which is easier to find. There's if you're academically inclined, but I find it harder reading, Kindleberger's Manias and Crashes is a good idea. Right, Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds is an okay idea, and there's a chapter in there on Nicholas Flamel.
The Alchemist.
The Alchemist. And Nicholas Flamel, of course, was only known to me elsewhere from Harry Potter movies.
Of course.
Right. But yes, it's quite clear that J.K. Rowling had read manias and crashes, because some of the details in the Harry Potter books
Had read Extraordinary Popular Delusions.
Yeah, Extraordinary Popular, Mackay's book.
Mackay, yeah. He plagiarised a lot from a German source for his Tulip Mania. There's a bit in that was very sensational.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But, it's a fun book.
This time is different, Rogoff and Reinhardt?
Yeah. But the answer is, pick 5 any 5.
Gotcha, okay.
Right? And the reason you got to pick 5 any 5 is that you just need to know the patterns of human nature.
Yeah.
Right? Because you will hit a period where everything looks rosy and then everything looks shit. And it wasn't rosy, and in fact it wasn't shit at the end either. Right? This is inherent in human nature. And yeah, I mean, some asset bubbles are bigger than others. The idea that Australia only ever had 3 asset bubbles is kind of quaint in my view, but it may be true that we only had 3 ridiculously off the scale enormous ones.
There was some bubbly behaviour in the early 19th century. We had a depression in the 1840s, I think.
We had one in the 1890s too.
Well, the 1890s is one of the clear examples, one of the 3. But I just mean, I'm trying to think of some of the others.
The Melbourne property bubble and then...
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's called the Melbourne property bubble, but it was really a Melbourne and Sydney property bubble as well.
Yeah, but it was strong. It was stronger in Melbourne.
It's definitely stronger in Melbourne, but prices still
Melbourne was in
Sydney.
1885 probably the richest city in the world per capita.
Yeah.
And the bubble took that to its illogical limit.
There's a fantastic book called The Land Boomers by Michael Cannon.
I've not read it, but again, as I say...
Yep.
Reading 5 is compulsory.
Yeah. But so...
Reading 30 is not.
Gotcha. So to come back to this point, you did really well, but it was a bull market. What you said sort of reminds me of a quote of Steve Eisman's when he was talking about the 2000s crash and the Great Recession. He was criticising Wall Street, and he said that they mistook leverage for genius.
Yeah, bull market gets mistaken for genius.
Yeah.
Leverage gets mistaken for genius. Leverage in a bull market is really mistaken for genius.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, leverage... I have a slogan here, which is that leverage is for the very young. And the reason is that leverage works most of the time. If you find something that's sensibly priced, just sensibly priced, not crazily priced, and you lever up into it, you'll probably make money. And if the stock market's middle of the range and, if the stock market is 100% of GDP market cap, which it will be at some stage again, I'm thinking S&P to US GDP, S&P market cap to US GDP. It's gone as low as 70 in recent years. It's gone as high as sort of 140 or 150 or whatever it is. I don't know what it is at the moment. But if it's in the middle of the range and you lever yourself, you'll probably get rich. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that works 9 times out of 10. Now, when you're 23, getting your first $1 million together is ridiculously hard. Right? It's just ridiculously hard. Once you've got it together, you must never risk it. Mm. Hence my slogan, it's for the very young. You do it when you're 23 and you don't do it again.
Yep.
Now, I know people who have been bust every cycle. There's 1 or 2 of them on Twitter. And they're just sort of go-go, right? And they don't have that slogan in their head. Every boom they get rich, and every bust they give it all back again. And the trick, of course, is the personality type that says, yeah, I'm going to have the foot to the floorboards, and then I'm going to stop. And then I'm going to drive like my grandmother for the rest of my life. Right? And it just doesn't seem sensible, right? It's just not the way humans are wired, but it's the way you should be wired if you're 22. Leverage is for the very young. Yep.
So by the late 90s,
I stopped.
When you realised this, you stopped. You'd made about $900,000 for yourself.
Yeah, depending on how you valued a little bit of property I owned, I was either a millionaire or not a millionaire.
And how old were you?
Late 20s.
And this is not including the money from the girl who...
Yeah, and this is not including the money. I was well-to-do.
Yeah.
Now, had the market been different the previous 3 years, I could have got myself into terrible trouble. I mean, I really was stupid. And I used leverage, and I did all sorts of things like that. And
you got margin loans? Or?
I had margin loans. I had all sorts. Right?
Yeah.
I tended to buy speculative things on margin loans. I worked out ways of leveraging myself up even further. Right? It all worked beautifully, right? And I was so stupid, it was insane. And my slogan, leverage is for the very young, applies to my own life, but I applied it by accident, right? I just worked, I just started reading enough textbooks and my leverage came down, right? And then by sort of 1999, I could see fraud everywhere. And, my particular one was at VoiceNet. And you will be just a weirdo if you remember VoiceNet. But VoiceNet was a speech recognition software company listed in Australia that actually made the ASX 300, I think. It had a market cap of about 700 million, which in Australia is not a small market cap. It sold software in Chile, and it said publicly that they had a Chilean telephone company as one of their biggest customers. The accounts showed software sales in Chile, and we later worked out that they had a shop in Chile selling shrink-wrapped Microsoft software, which they called software sales. And I guess the auditor could sign off, you're selling copies of Microsoft Windows, they could sign off that as software sales. But they're not software sales in the sense that I developed software which has a zero marginal cost and I sold it. I'm just a retailer. They told people that they had sold stuff to a Chilean telephone company, and one of my friends could speak Spanish and decided he was going to ring up every Chilean telephone company and ask them if they bought any software. I think that person, although I haven't confirmed, is somebody who calls themselves Oddlot on Twitter. Right? I'm just suspicious it's the same person. Anyway, Oddlot, I'll call him, right? Worked out that they were lying. And this was the first time I saw a widely discussed open register stock that was a complete out-and-out fraud. It was actually the first thing I ever shorted. Right? And it took me ages to work out how to short it. And I was so naive that I shorted like $5,000 worth because I didn't know whether it would work or not. And it worked, of course.
So you were disbelieving probably momentarily. Was there any self-doubt, or were you certain this was a fraud?
Oh, no, I was certain this was a fraud, right? We'd, by this stage, worked out that all their software sales, which were shrink-wrapped Microsoft software, right? And we'd worked out that their biggest customer did not exist.
Now, when you say we, is that Platinum?
No, this was before I worked at Platinum.
I'll come to that later.
This was Oddlot and Simon, who now works with me, and myself. Right, we were on a prototype stock chat board called the Chimes, which has since ceased to exist. But Simon likes to think that I was a doyen of the Chimes, and I probably was. But that's how Simon and I met each other on this prototype stock chat board. Simon's the other half of Bronte Capital.
Yeah,
but it was collectively the working group of the Chimes that worked it out.
And was the Chimes...
and Oddlot was called Oddlot on the Chimes as well.
Was it an international chat board or just Australian?
No, well, it tended to focus on Australian stocks.
Yeah.
Right. And ASIC didn't like it, actually, right, because it was run by somebody who had a record of going bankrupt in the previous cycle. Right. But the Chimes was actually an important part of my life because it was the first time I got to talk to a lot of other people about stocks. And it's also the first time that I started reading all this stuff. And it was the first time that I, worked out that there were frauds, right? And there were ones that weren't frauds as such, but they were pretty suspicious, like Davnet. And Davnet was another $700 million company. It even got a $250 million investment from a Japanese telco. And it did this wonderful thing of setting up telescopes on buildings so that they could use lasers rather than fibre optic cable to give fast internet to that building. This is an idea that just doesn't fly these days. Weirdly, Meade Telescopes, who make beautiful retail telescopes. You know, I have a 5-inch telescope at home made by Meade. Meade at one stage had a market cap of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was because it was making telescopes to put on buildings that were being used for internet transfer. Right, rather than, fibre optic looping the building, which is what you would do now. And the stuff was absurd. Now, Davnet had wired a few buildings, and on the basis of wiring a few buildings, it had almost $1 billion market cap. The family that control it are still multi-millionaires. They've sold all the stock, and, the stock, of course, went to zero. It wasn't a fraud. It was just a hype merchant, whereas VoiceNet was a pretty evil fraud. VoiceNet also became a central stock in my life later because it was the way that I met Marc Cohodes.
Yeah, so tell us about the email that changed your life.
Marc used to run a radio show called Facts from the Other Side of the Tracks, and I've got to say it in Marc's accent. He used to say it in the most ridiculous American drawl. And Facts from the Other Side of the Tracks used to just take pot shots at stocks all the time. And in fact, Marc was wrong about some of them. For instance, he had a short on Whole Foods at one stage. And that didn't work out very well. Right? Whole Foods became a phenomena. Right? But it was an expensive leveraged grocery store at the time. And Marc didn't believe in expensive leveraged grocery stores. He was wrong. But on the stock that he talked about most was a company called Lernout and Houseby. And Lernout and Houseby was the biggest flat fraud in the world in the .com era. And Marc, pointing the finger at Lernout and Houseby was the sort of tech equivalent of pointing the finger at Enron. Right? This was a really big name company. Now, it did speech recognition software. And in 1999, you could walk into a room which would be covered in servers, and they'd have nice neon flashing lights, sort of like a server farm from a 1999 James Bond film. Nobody thinks about a server farm anymore. They're just sort of boxes that Google or Amazon put somewhere, right? And they're very dark, but this one had lots of flashing lights, just for show. And you could speak into a microphone, and it would demonstrate the holy grail of speech recognition. And the holy grail is you speak into the microphone, it recognizes the speech, it then puts it through a translation program, so it translates it to another language, and then puts it through a speaking program. And the translation program was rudimentary, and the speaking program was rudimentary. But it was demonstrating the holy grail, which is that you can speak into a phone in one language, and it will speak out of the phone in another language. And this thing had Microsoft and Intel as investors. And it was basically the hottest tech stock in Europe. In fact, there was a European stock exchange called the eStack, which was meant to list sort of European tech stocks as a competitor to Silicon Valley. And Lernout and Houseby was the biggest stock on the eStack. And we now know that it was a complete Wizard of Oz type fraud. There was no speech recognition software. There was a guy literally behind the curtain typing. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
And this was for their demonstrations?
Yes. Yeah. Every one of the demonstrations was fake, but they had managed to fool both Microsoft and Intel. And if they had fooled Microsoft and Intel, to say this was a fraud was kind of remarkable. Marc Cohodes was running around saying, this thing's a fraud. And Microsoft has just put, $500 million or whatever the number was in. And you presume that Microsoft know how to do due diligence on a software company and don't waste their $500 million. Right? And in those days, Microsoft could do no wrong. Remember, the tech stock bubble had been going on and on and on. Nor could Intel, and they'd also put in $500 million or whatever it was. None of it existed. was all stolen. Now, Learnout and Houseby did a 1-month roadshow with VoiceNet in Australia. And it turns out ex post that VoiceNet was selling software to Learnout and Houseby, and Learnout Houseby was selling software to VoiceNet, right? And they were both counting it as sales, but in fact nothing was going between them at all, right? It's just fake sales on both sides. But if I spent a month on the road with you and you're a complete fraudster, I'd work it out. Learnout and Houseby willingly spent a month on the road with VoiceNet. And VoiceNet was a complete fraud. We could prove that fairly easily. So my assumption was that Learnout and Houseby must also be a complete fraud. And I wrote this all out, including the proof that VoiceNet was a complete fraud, and sent it to Marc Cohodes, who I'd never heard of except from the radio show. And Marc sent back an email which he doesn't remember, but which changed my life, which said, "Congratulations, you have proof number 28. And in fact, he was right. He really did have 27 different proofs that Learnout and Houseby was a fraud. 27 different ways of working it out. And he had this massive oversized position in Learnout and Houseby. And he was working all day, every day on Learnout and Houseby. And I'm struggling to work out why he was working all day, every day on Learnout and Houseby, because he already knew it was a fraud. There wasn't anything else that he could learn, right? It's like, this was his sort of... My attitude to this is, yeah, you've worked that one out. Next stock, please.
Yeah.
Right? And then I want to split the position. But Marc started the year 2000, 6% short Learnout and Houseby. And it was a $10 stock. And by October, it was a 1 cent stock. And $10 to 1 cent in 10 months looks like a pretty good return to me as a short seller, except, and the except is that it went via $65. And if you're 6% short at $10, you're 36% short at $60, except that your capital's gone from 100 to 70, so you're 36 on 70, which is a bit over 50% short, which means your dear friends at Morgan Stanley or whoever, or Interactive Brokers, are closing down your account. And what would be really annoying here is not only do they close your account down and put you out of business, but you're right. Now, Marc wasn't going to get put out of business on this. He's not that silly. But he bought it all the way up, and he bought it and he bought it and he bought it. And, there's a top tick at $65. I'm going to guess that was Marc Cohodes buying. And then as it goes back down, he sells some more. And he sells it and he sells it and he sells it and he sells it and he sells it. And he likes me to remind people that he made a profit. And he did. He made about 1% of his fund, and he made 100% of the profit between $2 and $0. And I thought to myself, this is the greatest feat of stock picking I've ever seen, right? To pick the biggest fraud in the world in the dot-com era, sitting in an office somewhere and just working out that Microsoft and Intel have been deceived. It was the greatest single piece of stock picking I've ever seen. And not make much money. And it's like, if you'd made this a 60-bit position and found 5 more of them, you make more money, right? If you had attached it to a long position, so you'd used the money you made in Learnout and Houseby when it was to buy real companies. And, let's just stick to tech. When Learnout and Houseby went to 0, Amazon was the buy of the century, right? It had already dropped 70% before it goes up another 100-fold, right? And if you'd paired buying really quality tech and shorting real shit tech, and you'd managed to risk, your returns were pretty astonishing. And so the question was, that was right at the core of Bronte when we set it up, was how do you manage the portfolio buying really quality stocks and fund it by shorting shit? And how do you industrialize the search for shit so that you don't spend all day producing proofs number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 28, right? You really just want, look, I know it's a fraud. Next one, please. And next one, please. And next one, please. And, Simon is kind of good at disciplining me this. We have a short, we put 50 bips on, it's up threefold or fourfold. It's now a 2% short. And by this stage, I've done lots of work on it because, it's bit me in the face. And Simon will say, you've got to cover some. And I'd say, but it's the best short I know. And he says, there's 25 more out there. Go find them. You're being lazy. And now we don't even have that discussion. Simon just raises his eyebrows, and I know what the end of that discussion is. I just got to go out and find another 5 shorts. Right? And he's right. I was just being lazy. Right? Decent portfolio management means a lot of good positions that are balanced. And that's actually hard work. Right? And, as a retail investor, you might get a good position every now and again, right? But working out what to do with it is hard. And working out how to fit it into a portfolio that doesn't leave you in tears once a cycle is also hard. And in my ideal world, I have a computerized Marc Cohodes. And the reason why it's a computerized Marc Cohodes is it takes all his unbelievable stock selection and it industrializes it. And by industrializing it, I can diversify it and de-risk it. Right? Marc is still my model for the best stock selector I've ever seen. Right? He's uncannily good at it. He is absolutely not my model on how to run a portfolio. And that's fine. Marc is full on. Right? You're never gonna have a boring time with Marc Cohodes.
I got pretty drunk the first time I met him.
Only the first time? I mean, there's one speed here. The funniest thing is I was flicking through Marc's photos at one stage and realizing that because he's just so gas fun, he hangs around all sorts of other gas fun people. So I'm flicking through there and there he is jamming a guitar or trying to sing with Bruce Springsteen. And I'm thinking, why is Bruce Springsteen with this weird finance guy? And the answer is, because he's gas fun. He's just the sweetest guy you've ever met.
Yeah.
Right? But he is not my model on how, that Learn Out and Houseby story where he was spectacularly right. More right than you could imagine.
Weren't they so certain they'd hacked or they'd tapped into the Wi-Fi at one of these presentations?
That's
is that
one
story
of the
true?
stories I've heard.
Right.
I think it's true, right? Which is that they'd worked out that there was Wi-Fi signal going around, which meant that there was somebody behind a curtain typing at the right time. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Right.
But there was so many proofs that this thing was fraud. And the weirdest thing is Marc was laying the entire fraud out in late 1999. And the stock only went up another 6-fold. Right? And the market was completely crazy in 1999. And then it was double, triple, quadruple, 6-fold. But crazy doesn't follow the rules of maths. 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times crazy is just crazy.
Yeah. So
it's there's a mathematical term for that where, 6 times X is still just X.
Yeah.
Right? Only works with 0, but it also works with crazy. 6 times.
So the pernicious thing about frauds is that if you can make up a lot of your earnings with the stroke of a pen, why not? Why make them 10 million? Why not make them 100
million?
million?
I mean, the famous example, of course, is Bre-X. And Bre-X is a stock that gives me nightmares. There are at least 3 books written on Bre-X, and I've read them all. Right. And the reason I've read them all is that there was actually a bad movie made about Bre-X too, starring Matthew McConaughey, called Gold.
Right.
Right. But Bre-X was a gold mine in Borneo. And it was, to be honest, just a standard Canadian garden variety gold mining fraud. And I perfectly happily short these with $300 million market cap, but I just short 10 basis points of them, right? So one tenth of 1% or one fifth of 1%, right, of my portfolio. And the idea is that they go to zero with monotonous regularity, and you should eventually be able to clip these 1/5 of 1%. And if you do it enough times, you make money. Except that every now and again, you're short. The classic is you got a fake gold mine. It has 1 million ounces in the ground. It has a market cap of 300 million, but there's no gold there really. It's going to zero. So you're short your 1/5 of 1% of it, and you probably make it. Except that Bre-X's fake 1 million ounces became a fake 180 million ounces. Bre-X was by a factor of 3 the biggest gold mine ever found in human history. The market cap went to 35 billion, which, as you might notice, is more than 100 times my $300 million stock. So if I'd shorted it and stayed shorted, even my 1/5 of 1% would have become a 5 or 6% position, and I would have been forced to cover it. If I'd been really stupid and shorted, say, 3% of it, I would have been completely wiped out on a 3% position on which I'm right. This is not much fun.
When was this company around?
The late 90s.
Okay.
Now, the company the whole story is more ridiculous than you can imagine. The chief geologist was a guy called Gruzman who sold a lot of stock. And Gruzman almost certainly did the fraud. He just bought gold from local river panners, right? And he'd sprinkle that gold into the sample before he sent the sample off to the lab. And in retrospect, we know they were fraud because the gold that you find in hard rock is pointy, but the gold you find in the river is rounded, and all the gold in the sample was rounded. So it didn't come from the hard rock, it was added afterwards. Now, Gruzman did cash a lot of stock, and the money disappeared somewhere into the ether. And the whole fraud unwound in part after Mr. Gruzman fell out of a helicopter, and his body was eaten by tigers and never found again. No, I'm not joking. This actually happened with a 30 billion market cap company, where the geologist fell out of a helicopter and his body was eaten by tigers, never to be seen.
But was that like the cover story for him disappearing? Or
He's never been seen since.
why were there tigers under the helicopter?
It's in Borneo.
Okay.
Right. I mean, seriously. Right? You could, if I made that up, you wouldn't believe me. Right? But,
Yeah.
And the weirdest thing but Bre-X also has another lesson. This thing had a market cap of $35 billion, and they needed $10 billion to build the mine. This was going to be one of the biggest gold mines ever built. And in the process, Tommy Suharto helped himself by changing the license rules to 10% of the company. And this was one of the, flagships of the Suharto regime's corruption. In reality, the Suharto regime exposed themselves as globally corrupt to get 10% of a worthless fraud. But nonetheless, that's, you defrauded, you had fooled the Indonesian government too. But I think it was Homestake Gold, had agreed to put $10 billion in. And before they actually put it in, they did some due diligence. And they drilled holes parallel to the Bre-X holes, 1 metre apart. So one hole goes straight down here for 400 metres, and that one contained 35 ounces of gold in the sample, really rich. Another one, exactly 1 metre apart, drilled parallel, had no gold in it. And Bre-X and Homestake put out a little press release saying that they were withdrawing from the agreement, having drilled 2 parallel holes and found no gold. The stock dropped 90%, right? From $30 billion to $3 billion, or two and a bit billion. It dropped 95%. It was almost just over $2 billion. And it was the short of its lifetime then, right? Because by this stage, you knew it was a fraud. 2 people had, a reputable party had drilled parallel holes and walked away. right? The geologist had already fallen out of the helicopter. The stock was down 90%, but so what? It was still going to drop 100. It took another sort of 15 weeks for the stock to go essentially asymptotically to zero. And that's an interesting lesson, because when was the best time to short it? Sure as hell weren't at 20 billion, right? Because if you shorted at 20 billion, it could go to 50. Right? The best time to short it was after the 90% drop. All you had to do was think logically about it. Right? And people say there isn't free money sitting on the table. But shorting Bre-X after the 90% drop was as close to free money as ever exists on Wall Street. Right? It was straight to zero in 10 weeks. Right? And no risk at this point. You know, the chief geologist is dead, and the reputable counterparty has said, yeah, we drilled the holes and there's no gold. What could go wrong with that short? It was sort of interesting, because I'd probably have shorted it. I'd have found the scummy people, shorted it at 300 million on the way up, and nursed a 4 or 5 percentage point loss. And we have sizing rules, you know, because the problem with a fraud is a fraud can go from, 300 million to 30 billion and back to zero, and 300 million silly, and 3 billion is silly, and 30 billion is silly, but it's not 10 times or 100 times as silly. But in fact, at 2 billion on the way down, that was 100 times as silly. There was no conceivable way that stock was going up. Right? By this stage, it had been exposed as a souffle, and to borrow the famous Paul Keating line, a souffle does not rise twice.
In your 2000...
He said that about a fellow politician. It's one of the best lines ever, you know. He's just sort of this vacuous souffle. He's all air. Bit fancy, though.
Was that John Hewson?
No, it wasn't. It was Andrew Peacock.
Peacock, yeah.
Yeah, it was Andrew Peacock. Though, you see, in those days, I was in Canberra. Right, so I was sort of very familiar with what was going on then.
Yeah.
Right, the souffle doesn't rise twice. It's just one of these great lines. I was reminiscing with Ken Henry a while back about it, and Ken was pulling out other ones, right, that he remembered just from, rehearsal lines, or because Ken was actually in Keating's office during part of that period, and Ken sort of remembers them in the most fond way. Keating would just pop out with these zingers after zinger after zinger.
In your December 2017 client letter, you said that...
Oh, the wonderful letter. That was the letter that every retail investor avoided and about half a dozen professional investors thought was great. I point this out because it was a letter about portfolio management. And as I said at the very beginning of this, portfolio management's for keeps. It's what delineates the really good people. And this was the only letter I ever wrote about portfolio management. And seriously, half a dozen big-name hedge fund managers have emailed me and said how much they liked that letter. And not a single retail investor or single client emailed me with the same thing.
Can I be the first retail?
Yeah, okay.
Right. Treat this as an email.
All right, I will.
But in that letter you wrote, quote, "You would rather be Warren Buffett than even the best of the short sellers," end quote. Are you just alluding to what we just spoke about, which is that shorts aren't subject to the laws of gravity, or is there another lesson in there?
Well, look, a straight 100% short portfolio probably loses money, no matter how good you are. And the reason is the sort of things that we short. A gold mine in Busang. Now, you don't know where Busang is, except I've just told you. It's in Borneo. Right? Or a biotech that is a treatment for Fragile X syndrome. Now, you might know what Fragile X syndrome is, but I had to look it up. Or a biotech that treats some rare children's disease that nobody's heard of and affects 400 kids but can get orphan drug status. Or a tech company in London that has a better way of searching videos that hasn't yet been demonstrated. That's a real one. It's called Bre-X. Right? And that went to zero. Now, none of these things, you don't own that biotech because you're really interested in Fragile X syndrome. And you don't own that gold mine because you're really interested in Busang. Right? You own them with a deep desire to get rich. And a deep desire to get rich, and fraud per se, is a high beta activity. Nobody particularly desired to get rich in 2009. Everybody desired to get rich in 2016. In 2009, they desired to stay solvent. But in fact, it was the right time to desire to get rich. All right. Now, the sort of benchmark beta of these stocks is about 2.
Can you just tell people what beta means?
Means that if the market moves up 10%, these things will move up 20.
Yeah.
If the market moves down 10, these things will move down 20. Now, that's just short-term movement. Now, let's just imagine you're the world's best short seller. I'm thinking Marc Cohodes, who's almost always right. He was wrong about Whole Foods, but, he's almost always right. Marc is short a bunch of these things, and on average, they'll go to zero over 7 years. He's no good at picking the timing, right? In fact, if they go to zero over 7 years, he should make 14% a year, which would be a very adequate return, thank you. Except that they go up and down on the way to zero. And up and down can be up and down a lot. And, the learn out and houseby thing is one of those. But, in the last couple of months, the stock market's up 10%. I don't know why it's up 10%. I promise you an awful lot of our shorts are up 20. Right? I know why they're up 20. The answer is the stock market's up 10. Right? They're just too beta. Right? And so you start 100% short, and the stock market does its thing, and you're now 120 short, except your capital's 80. So you're 120 on 80 short, which means you're 150% short, which means that you better start buying stock to get back to 100. You get back to 100, and in May this year, I don't know, maybe May this year is the month that the market goes down 10%. And let's be, you're a hero this time. Your stocks are down 25, right? In other words, they've behaved worse than the market, right? Even at beta adjusted. So you're now 75 short, except your capital's 125. So you're 3 on 5 short, which is 60% short. You want to stay a short seller, you better start selling stock. And you get down to being 100 short again. Now, you'll note what's happened here. Every time the market goes up, you get to buy. And every time the market goes down, you get to sell. And this means you buy high and you sell low. And if you buy high and sell low, you don't make any money. Right? It doesn't work very well on Wall Street. In fact, I've sort of spent my life trying to avoid buying high and selling low.
It's a good rule.
But if you run a structural short book, that's what inevitably is going to happen to you.
Yeah.
And this buy high and sell low erodes your returns. So you should be getting 14% a year because the stocks on average go to zero, right? And in fact, you probably wind up with about zero. Right? If you run a straight short book, I don't think you can make money. Now, if you run a competent long book, you should make money. The idea at the core of Bronte was that I don't like this whipsawing on the short, but we're actually very good at it. Right? So what I want to do is run shorts against the longs, and then whenever the market goes down, the shorts give me cash. My longs have gone down too, but they're high-quality companies, so I'm fairly confident that they'll return. And I've got a big whack of cash, and guess what I can do? I can buy longs at low prices. And then when the market goes up again, as if I can't find longs, I'll just increase the shorts a little. Right? And effectively, I'll make the rebalancing effect work for me by having the shorts deliver me the cash at the right time. That's the sort of portfolio idea at the core of Bronte. And there's a whole lot of maths around it. And I've just hired a mathematician. And the reason I've just hired a mathematician is we have a bunch of heuristic rules of thumb about how we should manage shorts. We have 200 of them, and the reason we have 200 of them is that I've tried to computerize Marc Cohodes.
200 heuristics?
200 shorts.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I have right?
Yeah.
But my heuristics are very, feel which way the wind is going, right? They're good. They're thought through, right? Portfolio management isn't, right? The December letter is highly thought through.
Yeah.
but I've never modelled it to the intensity that I should. And so I've hired a mathematician to help me out here. So there will be an internal version of the December letter written in about 2 years' time, I suspect, which gets the material in our December portfolio management letter down pat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, down pat is going to be questions about how do you time shorts better. And sometimes the timing rule is, you just know, right? Like if you thought it logically, Bre-X was the do of its life when it was down 95%.
Mm.
And once you've worked that out, the right size for it is 3 or 4%, right? Because it's not going to go up tenfold in your face. And if it's not going to go up tenfold in your face, you can be larger, right? So Bre-X should have been a large short, right? Whereas Bre-X, before it was exposed as a fraud, has to be a small one. And the reason it has to be a small one is that it can go 10x higher very quickly. Enron was the do of its life at $20 on the way down. It was a very big struggle from 80 to 20 and from 20 to 0 extremely fast. And at $20 on the way down, the core had already been exposed. The various off-balance sheet arrangements, the Jedis and Chewbacca's and Death Stars had all been exposed. The banks had already had their credit lines drawn, and the counterparties were running away as fast as they could. Right? At this point, it was the do of its life. It's not often that the timing makes itself obvious. Most of the time, our timing is rules of thumb and heuristics, and we've hired a mathematician to try and make them better. But you'll do very well just with the heuristics. And the simple heuristics are, don't be oversized in frauds, right? Don't be oversized in any sector that could be frauds. So if, you can't be short 5% in one gold stock because it could be Bre-X. You can't be short 10% gold stocks because the cluster of them are correlated to each other, and a cluster can move like one stock, right? But you can be, if your cutoff is 30 basis points in one stock, it can be 6% in the, a collection of gold stocks. Then don't be net short if you can tolerate it, because the whipsawing effect that I described, if you're 100% net short, 10% market movements do you in. If you're 50% net short, 20% market movements do you in. If you're 25% net short, 40% market movements do you in, but you're still being done in this bull market, right? So don't be very net short. You can be net long. Then the other heuristics are, when everybody's making money, when dumb people are making money, it's time to pretend that it's hard, or at least work out it's hard. And, the bellboy is a famous thing, but, if you can sell tech stocks to a financial planner in Doncaster, then it's probably time to stop buying tech stocks. And it's not that I have a real problem with financial planners in Doncaster, but, it's... If they have gold-rimmed spectacles, then I really have a problem.
Yep.
Right? But, there is a sort of... They're the bellboy in our modern world.
Now, in 2011, Bronte, from memory, was usually around 50 to 60 basis points on average per short. So you'd have up to 50 shorts.
Yeah.
If you have 200 now, does that mean on average you're 15 basis points?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And there are several reasons. The first one is computerized Marc Cohodes gets better and better and better.
So you've been scaling.
We have a big, hairy, audacious goal here, which is to find every fraud in the world and short 5 basis points of it.
Wow.
And do it with computers.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a realistic goal.
Does that mean you think that there's 600 frauds in the world?
Yep.
Right.
Yep. There's a lot of bad people.
Yeah.
Right. And the stock market's an interesting place. You go and buy $5,000 worth of a stock as a retail investor all the time, and the person that's selling to you is invisible.
Yeah.
And they might or might not be a related party to the holders. And if it is a related party, then they've got a very big incentive to sell the story. Right? I mean, I'm not going to give $5,000 to anyone, but in the stock market, I seem to do it. Right? So it's an unbelievably good place for a fraudster to turn up. Very anonymous. Right? So, yeah, and in the world there, it wouldn't surprise me that there were 600. I don't know, but we can find 200 at the moment. Right? It might also be that we can find 200 at the moment because we're very late in a bull market. And there'll be another time when the bull market is smashed and they can only find 30.
That's plausible.
Right? But I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Because we haven't had the computerized Marc Cohodes for that long.
A piece of context for everyone listening at home, I think we might have missed this, but just to help all of that make sense, Bronte remains around 100% long and 30% short?
More like 110 or 115 long.
Okay.
And we're currently more like 60% short.
Right.
Now, the reason why we're more like 60% short is that I can find shorts really easily and I can find longs not at all. And in a different environment, if I can't find shorts and I can find longs, then I'm going to be longer.
For a long time, you were net 70% long.
Yeah, and I started shrinking that in about 2016.
Okay.
And it's now 2019, so I've thought the market was overpriced for 3 years and it's done nothing but go up with a couple of blips. Right? So I've been wrong.
Yeah.
Right? But now part of the reason, I used to say it quite clearly, which was if I could find shorts at will and longs not at all, then I'm just going to reduce the net exposure. Now, part of the problem is that computerized Marc Cohodes gets better and better and better. My fantasy is, of course, computerized Marc Cohodes, because Marc is just the greatest person ever. Right? But computerized Marc Cohodes gets better and better. It's still nowhere near as good as the real thing, and it doesn't drink as much. But as it gets better, we find shorts easier. And I'm not sure whether the fact that we're finding them easily now is because we're better at finding them or because there are more out there. So there are all sorts of, illusions here. But we sort of imagine a world where we can't find them, and then we'll go back to being 100 long.
Yeah.
Right? And there are various measures of how high the market is. One is a famous one, which doesn't work anymore, is how many Ben Graham stocks there are in the market. Nets where you can liquidate them for cash. Japan is full of Ben Graham stocks. The rest of the world is not. And that measure worked for a long time. If you just looked at the proportion of stocks that were Ben Graham stocks and got long when that proportion was high and trimmed it off when it was low, you actually outperformed dramatically. The problem is there are no Ben Graham stocks left, and getting long in Japan hasn't worked very well. Our particular measure of where the market is high or low is just how easily I can find shorts. Shorts with 200, 300, 400 million market cap that are just bullshit, complete bullshit. And unfortunately, at the moment, I can find shorts with 5 billion market cap that are complete bullshit that used to have 500 million market cap, and you can understand what that does to your portfolio.
John, I want to ask you one more background question and then come back to some of the finer points of short selling. And the background question is, in 1999, you started at Platinum Asset Management.
It was January 2000, but yes.
Okay, January 2000. Tell us how you got the job.
Dumb luck. Absolute dumb luck. I was going to... I'd been working in ANZ Bank and it wasn't much fun. And I was talking with Ken and Ted Evans about moving back to Canberra because I sort of missed it. And I had a job interview lined up in Canberra. I had applied for about a dozen jobs at fund managers, and I had literally not received a single interview.
So you're about 29.
Yeah, so I'd sent letters to Colonial and BT and, third tier fund managers, and I hadn't received a single interview. And then I was sitting next to a a woman on the ferry who turned out to be a headhunter, and I just chatted with her. And she said, I could get you an interview. And so literally that day I had an interview with Kerr Neilson, and I walked out of the interview with a job. And I remember him asking me what salary I expected. And I said, well, I've got this thing lined up in Canberra, and this is what it earns. So, and he immediately added 20,000 to it. And in retrospect, I clearly undersold myself, right? Because he upped it that year and upped it again the next year, right? But it was just dumb luck, right? I'd given up trying to find a job in finance markets, and my CV was definitely, non-standard. But and the other thing was that I literally didn't understand the structure of it. I didn't know what investment bankers did. I didn't know what, I didn't realize, for instance, how much more special the buy side was than the sell side. Right? I knew who Kerr Neilson was, and this was sort of like the Australian equivalent of having your first interview being with Warren Buffett and him offering you the job, right? But it really was that left field, right? We planned to leave New Zealand, where I was working at the time. I was working at that time for New Zealand Treasury, which was probably the least satisfactory job I'd ever had.
So you've gone from ANZ to New Zealand Treasury.
Yeah, there's a woman involved in changing all these jobs.
Yeah.
Yes.
and all the while you're trying to get a job in finance, but it's not working.
I just couldn't get an interview.
Yeah.
Literally, I couldn't get my foot through the door. Now, it turns out that, in exchange, I've been extremely liberal about granting interviews to people, right? If people approach me on LinkedIn, I tend to give them a 5-minute interview. I have hired people from 5-minute interviews that became, 45-minute interviews that became 3-day interviews. But nonetheless, we tend to interview everybody. And
you're not going to regret saying that.
I'm probably going to regret saying that, but I assure you that they're 5-minute interviews.
Okay.
And they are harsh.
Right.
You are going, if you do apply off this, you're going to get screwed over in the interview. It just happens. Right? It's the quid pro quo of interviewing everybody is that you have to be harsh. Right? So, yeah, I have. There's one question which I guarantee you'll get, which has come with your 3 best ideas.
Okay.
Right? Now, the reason I ask that is A, it tells me what you're thinking, and B, I might steal your 3 best ideas. It also turns out that, surprisingly, people have come with their 3 best ideas, and I've responded by shorting 2 of them. Right? But, I'm going to ask that question. So, right. But I'm not going to tell you the other questions I ask.
Yeah.
Right? Because that gives you a bit of prep.
Yeah.
But if you come with your 3 best ideas, then I learn something for my 5 or 10 minutes. Right, so it doesn't cost me anything, right? Which is why I'm not going to regret saying anybody that sends me a application through LinkedIn will get at least a 5-minute chat.
That's clever. Seems very positive sum.
So it's a positive sum thing for me, right? But you also have to acknowledge that if I'm going to interview 70 or 100 people, then I'm going to say, no, sorry, bang, right? And I'm not going to explain why, because I just don't have the time to explain why. Now, of the people that have interviewed that way, some I've hired and some I've farmed out to other fund managers. So there was a guy who worked for Platinum after I left, and I just rang Kerr and said, look, I'm not in a position to hire him, but you'd be interested. And in fact, there were 2 people that I sent that way, and they both got serious interviews, and one of them got the job. So even though I didn't hire them, it wasn't a waste of their time. They broke into the industry. Now, the truth is that when I broke into the industry, I had no idea how to do it. Right? I didn't even know how to fight. Right? I wouldn't have had the gumption to approach an older version of myself via LinkedIn. Right? And there was a lot of dumb luck.
But what do you think Kerr liked about you in that interview?
Oh, that's easy. I was completely unprepared.
Yeah.
Their biggest position was NTT Docomo, or it might have been Japan Telecom NTT. It was one of the pair of them. And that company had just invested $250 million in DavNet, and I thought they were going to lose their money. And I ripped into the Japanese company saying, look, it's run by imbeciles. I don't even remember which Japanese company, but I remember that they'd invested $250 million in DavNet. And I laid out why it was run by imbeciles. And then I laid out another stock which I kind of liked, but it turned out that he liked it and we both understood it. And finding out their largest holding and working out the bear case would be a pretty good start for an interview for most people. But in this case, I picked on their largest holding and I didn't know it was their largest holding. And Kerr is a really good guy. And a really good guy in financial markets likes to be told he's wrong, right? And likes rational arguments about why he's wrong. And the fact that I ripped apart his biggest holding
by accident
impressed him.
Right.
So yeah, I walked it. I mean, it couldn't have been luckier, right? And the weirdest thing is, had I known it was their biggest holding, I wouldn't have ripped it apart. I wouldn't have had the courage. But because I didn't know they held it, I had plenty of courage.
That's interesting.
Right. Incidentally, pro tip here, find out what their largest holding is, right, when you get one of these interviews, and try and work out the bear case.
That's a good tip.
If they don't like that, you don't want to work for them anyway, right? Because you want to work for somebody who takes seriously the negative side of what they're doing, right? In this game, you will make mistakes. Warren Buffett makes mistakes. The only broker notes that I read are broker notes that disagree with me. So the only broker notes that I've read this year seriously are the ones by the JP Morgan analyst who hates the GE stock. He's actually mostly right, which is sort of annoying, right? Because I instinctively want to buy it. And he lays out why you shouldn't. I bought it anyway, right? But the reason I went and read him is he's so vehemently negative on the company that I had to know. Incidentally, the best broker notes are ones from fraudulent brokers. You know any fraudulent brokers? Send me their notes, right? And I read those all the time. And the reason is that if a fraudulent broker is tipping it, you want to short it, right? This is part of the way you find shorts.
Yeah.
This is computerized Marc Cohodes 101. Now, the real trick here is not shorting the stock. It's working out that the broker is fraudulent. And one of these days, I've never done it, I'm going to give one of my junior staff $100,000 to open accounts at 5 brokers and buy $2,000 worth of stock in each one. And the object is he's not allowed to buy a stock unless the stock is available to short. In other words, he's got to narrow it down to things that we can actually trade, and he will be rewarded for losing money the fastest that he can. Right. And in order to lose money in stocks he can short, he's got to go out, right, that are recommended by a broker. He's got to go out and systematically find all the bad brokers. Right. I've never done this, but the sort of game of how do you get a junior to lose $100,000 as fast as possible.
So how long was it between when you started looking for jobs in finance and you finally landed this job with Kerr in January 2000? 2.5
years, 3 years.
Okay.
2.5 years.
Were you losing hope at all?
Oh, I'd lost it. Okay. I'd given up.
Right.
Right. Literally, I would never have applied for another job in finance had I not got the job working for Kerr. Right. I was past hope. The weirdest thing is I was clearly successful. I'd made a 7-figure amount of money. Right. I'd learnt to turn off the brakes. I, in fact, had all the things that I would look for in a junior analyst. If a young me came through the door now, I would hire me. But I wouldn't have worked out how to get through the door. I mean, there's an American way of getting through the door, which is just go to an Ivy League university.
Yeah.
Right? You go to an Ivy League university, you seem to get the interview.
Yeah.
Right. I look at these, at American hedge funds, I look at these 24-year-olds, 26-year-olds who are working, who are really, really smart, to be fair. But the range of opportunities that they had at age 26 was just not available to me. Right? I just didn't know. I didn't know that they existed. Right? And, I'm not averse to hiring older people, in part because there's a little bit of real-world experience. The latest hire I've got is older than me. I've hired the mathematician. He's an old guy, right? But he's a sensible old guy, right? But a sensible young guy would have been a really good hire too. We interviewed a few of those. Some of them scared us.
Some of the sensible young guys?
Well, no, some of the young guys scared us.
Oh, what? In what sense?
I'm not going to give the whole game away, but pro tip, don't try, when the prospective employer takes you out to dinner, don't try to pick up the waitress.
And were they just virile young guys, or were they trying to impress you young guys?
I can't tell.
Right.
In another pro tip, which is, if in finance, if somebody asks you 30 questions, the answer to at least 7 of them should be, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. If your answer to at least 7 of them is not, I don't know, then I'm probably not going to hire you.
So
if
epistemic
your answer
humility.
to all of them is, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Then, right.
So you want the right balance of epistemic humility and knowledge.
Yes.
Okay.
That's hard to achieve, and it's very hard to achieve with a 23-year-old. Right. You generally have to be beat up a little.
Yep.
Now, there's a view on Wall Street that people who work for funds shouldn't have their own PAs. They shouldn't be, right? And the SEC, for instance, has very strict rules about PAs. And I've come to the opposite conclusion. If you hire a 24-year-old, he should have a PA. Right? And the reason he should have a PA is that he's going to lose money because young people are stupid.
Unforced errors?
Unforced errors. Just unforced error after unforced error after unforced error. Young people are stupid. I was too, don't worry. Yeah. Right? And the only reason I didn't lose a lot of money was that I read books at the right time. But the cheapest way of not losing money is learn the mistakes that other people make from books. The second cheapest way of not losing money is let your analysts lose it for you. Right? So you let these young people have their own personal account and trade it. You want them to lose a little bit of money.
Right.
Right? And the reason you want them to lose a little bit of money is that they can lose 50 grand. It really, really stings them.
Yeah.
Right? A young person who earns 100 grand a year, if he loses 50, that's diabolically nasty. In the context of $1 billion fund, it doesn't matter. Right? Now, I want him to learn his lesson on 50 grand. Preferably, I'd rather he learned his lesson on books. I cannot stress that enough. You have to read the 5 books. I don't care which 5, actually. Right? But you've just got to imbibe this stuff. Right? But if you're not going to do that and you want to be in the industry, losing a little bit of your own money actually helps. In the job interviews we gave, one of the strongest things that happened was that one of our candidates who we were marginal on had lost some money, and he explained to us how he lost it and the mistakes he made. And we thought, freak, that's great. Now, next time learn it from a book.
Yeah.
Right? But it's still great. Right? Just like, genius is a rising market and double genius is a rising market and leverage. Right? Losing a little bit of money is a good part of learning this business. Watching other people lose it and working out what their mistakes is cheaper. And the easiest way to do that is with books. Mm. But, I'm always a little bit fascinated when people screw up.
Yeah. You remind me of 2 adages. One is a wise man learns from others' mistakes, a fool his own. And
don't worry, you'll learn from your own as well. Yeah, that's inevitable. Of course.
And Seneca, I think he said, reading annexes others' lives to our own.
Yeah, that's it. Actually, that's really it. somebody poured a year or 2 years or 3 years of thinking into a book.
Yep.
And you can absorb that 3 years of thinking in one afternoon or one day. Often, actually, you only need to read the first. I mean, a lot of books have one idea in it, which they pound 50 different ways.
It could have just been a blog post.
It could have been a blog post.
Yeah.
You could read just the first couple of chapters and you probably get it. Some of the best thing I've read all year is actually a blog post. Right? And it's called What is Amazon by a guy called Cantor. I've tweeted it a few times. And there's more learning in that. I actually knew almost everything in that blog post, but it took me 10 years to work it out. And Cantor says it in one lovely 15,000 word blog post. You really should read it. Right? It starts with the sort of assumption that the world's best business is one that's going to develop global scale and share the benefit of that scale with their consumers. And the idea is that if you do that, you're going to be very, very big and nobody's going to be able to compete with you, right? And hence you will be very big, fairly thin margin, but okay. And, Walmart did that and Costco is doing that still. And Amazon is the global leader in that. And then the second question is, how the hell do you run such a business? Right? And there are certain things like you should grow as fast as possible subject to the constraint you don't run out of cash, because if you grow as fast as possible subject to the constraint you don't run out of cash, you're going to get to this holy land before you get competitors there. But that's easy to say. This post goes through meticulously all the steps that Amazon went through on that path. And it's a lot of learning. And if you want to do it, if you put Mr. Cantor on for a podcast, I would listen very, very happily. It's just a blog post. It's one idea taken to its logical limit, right? And you could probably write a whole book on it and hammer the point home. But I've just read the blog post 4 times.
Yeah. Do you think one reason people don't, so many books are bought but not read, is the price tag? Like $30.
No, the price tag is not $30.
No,
the
but
price tag is 6 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours.
Yeah, okay, right.
You can get samples that are first 5% of a book on Amazon. If you get through the sample and you've decided you want to read it, you should read it, right? My books bought but not read list is now, because of Amazon samples, is less than 30%. Books given to me and not read is over 70 or 80%.
Right.
Because I read the first chapter or two, and
yeah,
people do. But the real price tag of a book is not $30.
I get that.
Right?
That's that's probably the main reason. But what I mean is that a $30 price tag signals a certain amount of value, and people think, how could there be so much value in something worth just $30? They underestimate what they can learn.
Oh, yes, but correlation between price and value is not good in our society. Period.
Yeah.
Right. And the way we assess that, at one level, Amazon makes these things digital, right? There's no volume there at all, right? It's like selling software; it's all air, right? It's highly valuable air. I don't know. Libraries are full of books that are read and they're free. Right? So, no, I don't think that's right, actually. I just think the real price tag is 10 hours.
Time. Yeah, I agree with that.
And the price tag is high.
Yeah.
Right? It's 10 hours you could be playing computer games or going to the beach.
Yeah. I want to briefly come back to Platinum. So, Kerr's a legendary $1 billion net worth investor. And, you're working...
He's also a really fine individual, especially if you don't work for him.
Yeah, so I want to come to that. So, I mean, you variously described him as a genius and a freak, and I know you admire and try to emulate his long side investing.
Yeah.
But what lessons or anti-lessons did you learn and then apply to Bronte in terms of the way he set up his workplace?
First, on the stock selection.
Sure, yep.
On the stock selection, Kerr asks a single question about a business, which is, what's it got?
Okay.
What is it about this business that makes me want to own it in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? If you cannot answer what's it got, don't even come to the second question. If you keep presenting him ideas and you can't answer that, you will be fired. Mm-hmm. He fires regularly. He's got various models of what's it got, but essentially the pattern is a stock note, which is a much more formal experience at Platinum than it is at Bronte, was 15 pages about the business, 1 page about the management, 1 sentence about the valuation. If you understand what's it got, the valuation model writes itself. He was absolutely rigorous about testing that. That's the really good part of Kerr. Kerr has decent models about what's it got, and he is prepared to go to any depth at all to find industry understanding. He runs intellectually one of the tightest shops you could imagine, right? The standard, I remember looking at other mutual fund groups after Platinum and thinking, their standards are just low. The second problem with Kerr, the second thing about Kerr is Kerr can do every job at Platinum, administrative jobs, whatever it is, better than the person who does it. He's just a freak. And I can't do every job at Bronte better than people that here. Right? I mean, I hired a guy with a PhD in physics because he's better at certain things than me. Right? I hired a mathematician because he's a lot better at certain things than me. But Kerr seems to be better than everybody. And he's not very good at imparting how to get that next step. His internal training is not very high. And then the third problem is a personal one about ownership, which is, well, I only worked this out after I worked for Kerr. There's a wonderful book by David Einhorn called Fooling Some of the People All of the Time or something. And David Einhorn talks about a no broken thesis rule. If you bought something because of X and X is not true, he just turfs the whole position. And I realized that if you have that rule, you de-emotionalize it. And Platinum never de-emotionalized. It took forever to get a stock into the Platinum portfolio. Convincing Kerr of something was really, really hard. Then suppose you bought it because of X and you'd convince Kerr that X was true. And X is not true, and the stock is down 15%. The right thing to do is to say, I was wrong, and turf the stock. Just turf it. The wrong thing to do is to change your story to defend the stock. And because going to Kerr and saying, dear Kerr, I was wrong, is so hard, it's emotionally so draining, everybody wound up defending stocks that they shouldn't. And I would argue that Kerr Neilson is possibly the best initial picker of stocks in the world, but in fact not very good at managing the stocks once they're in his portfolio, because there isn't a process for saying, I was wrong and therefore this is what I'm going to do. Now, there's a consequence of this. What you really want your staff to do is try and get something in the portfolio that works really well and then prune it if it doesn't. And so you need them to be able to come to you and say, I was wrong. And if they're able to come to you and say that they were wrong, they must never be punished emotionally, psychologically, financially for telling you that they were wrong. They should be rewarded. But then you also have to reward them for giving you good ideas. And so you have this emotional problem, which is that they get all the credit for good ideas, And they get credit for bad ideas when they tell you that they were bad. Which means that essentially I have to take responsibility for the bad ideas. And it's psychologically very hard to run a business where your staff get all the credit and you get all the responsibility. But that's what I've tried to do at Bronte. Right? I've tried to take the really, really good bits of Kerr Neilson and get rid of the bad bits. Just like I've tried to take the really good bits of Marc Cohodes and get rid of the bad bits. And I swear I'm nowhere near as good at picking a stock on the long side as Kerr Neilson. I think, and this is yet to be tested in a downdraft, but I think I'm substantially better at modifying the portfolio once the stock is in. And I think I'm substantially better at managing the portfolio than Marc Cohodes. I'm not as good at picking the stock as Marc Cohodes either. And that's taken me a lot of time. It also makes Bronte a very pleasant place to work. And the reason it's a very pleasant place to work is the staff get all the credit and I get all the responsibility. Right? And from the staff's perspective, that's just wonderful. Right? But it does mean that they tell me that I'm wrong all the time. And my job, and to some degree, their job is to try and pick holes in my arguments, right? So they're always, nudging me. One of them, David in particular, has never gone a day without telling me I'm an idiot. Not in so many words, but he tells me I'm wrong here, here, and here. I can think of at least 5 things he's told me I'm wrong on today, and he's right about some of them. Right? And, that personality type that's always picking holes and whinging probably doesn't fit into a lot of firms, but they fit into Bronte really well. But this is sort of intellectualizing what Kerr did wrong, right? And I didn't think this through myself. I thought it through after reading David Einhorn's book, the no broken thesis rule in that book, and how he described it was one of those great revelations in my life.
So staff at Platinum, at least while you were working there, were afraid to admit to Kerr that they were wrong, so that created an incentive misalignment.
I'm going to be blunt.
Yeah.
I was afraid to tell Kerr I was wrong.
Okay. Have you told him that since?
Yes, but I'm still afraid to talk to him. He scares me, right? I mean, Kerr, I've known some really clever guys in my life. JJ was great. Ken Henry was just astoundingly great. Kerr is astoundingly great. The latter two are just astonishing. But Ken was also a really, really good manager of people. And Kerr is not. Kerr is just better at everything that they do. Right? And I know he's going to listen to this, so I'm sort of, because somebody's going to point it out to him, right? Somebody picking on his mistakes. And it's hard to pick on his mistakes because Kerr is just a genius. Right? You would do an awful lot worse in life than go back through the letters that he wrote to unit holders when he was at BT in the 80s and when he was at Platinum in the early 90s, in the high points of, he's just smart, like really smart and really good at it and actually quite humble about it, right? It's just, he's prickly and he's scary. He's intimidating, right? I was intimidated. I'd be less intimidated now because I'm a bit more comfortable in my own skin. I mean, to some degree, for the first few years I was at Platinum, I felt like I was an imposter, right? Because, I'd got this job by dumb luck, right? And they'd even made me a partner in the firm by dumb luck. The idea that made me partner was essentially short Conseco. And short Conseco came at least in part from Monty Montgomery, who was Marc Cohodes' sidekick. Now, by the time I laid it out, I knew far more about Conseco than Monty did. but the idea wasn't mine. I stole it. Right? It's a good idea, though.
Yeah.
I knew more about it than, to be fair about it, I spent 3 months working it out after Monty told me it was worth looking at. Right? And it was spectacularly worth looking at. Right? But, even then I felt like an imposter. Right? I have no pride about stealing other people's ideas. I still want to understand them. Mm-hmm. The reason you've got to understand them is if, when I shorted Conseco, it was $11 and it went 20 and then to zero. And if had I not understood it, right, and known I was right, I would have covered it. Instead, I added a little bit more. And if you just stole the idea without understanding the analysis, you'll get it wrong. You'll trade it badly. Right? And so, it's one thing to say I stole the idea, and I did, but I did the analysis properly. Mm-hmm. And I understood it better than they did at the end of it.
So Platinum Asset Management listed on the ASX in 2007?
Yep. And I left.
You essentially retired, I think, at the age of 39.
Yeah, I had enough money. I had enough money for what you'd call a good upper middle class retirement, but not rich.
But what did you think you would be doing? Just drinking pina coladas on Bronte Beach all day?
Well, actually, at least part of it was I was de-careizing.
Right. Okay.
Working for Kerr was both the best and the worst time of my life.
Okay.
Right. I was utterly miserable by the end of it. Right. And I was utterly miserable primarily because I didn't have the courage to deal with it properly. Right. I mean, I don't regret it, but I do a little bit. Right. I don't regret it because I learnt a lot, and he's a great man in that respect. But, when he intimidated me, mm-hmm. Right, and I felt like I was an imposter. Right? It's not a happy process. The other thing is, to be frank about it, I got bearish on US financials, really bearish in 2005. And they just kept going up. And I remember and there was a stock that Kerr actually pointed out that I just got spectacularly wrong, which was the big Dutch ABN AMRO. And I kept telling him what an awful business ABN AMRO was and how badly run it was. And then it got sold for $100 billion. And I remember my last performance review at Platinum, and Kerr said, "You're just wrong on that." And the answer was, well, I wasn't just wrong on that, right? ABN AMRO was worth zero. And the people who bought it, RBS and Fortis, both effectively blew up and became state wards, right? They paid $100 billion for a piece of worthless shit. Mm-hmm. And the net of borrowed money, and the net effect of which was that they were both bailed out by the British and Dutch governments, right? But that was hard. Right, being right and early, right? Is that portfolio. The other thing is that I didn't have the long side to go with it, right? Life's a portfolio too, and I was doing too much shorting, and hence my returns looked awful. Right? And I mean, yeah. Look, ABN AMRO was I right? Was I wrong? Who knows? Yeah. Right. I lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the other one that happened to us then was Royal Bank of Scotland, where Platinum was the biggest short in not Royal Bank of Scotland, in Charter One Financial, which was also bought by Royal Bank of Scotland. And the worst day of my career was the day that Charter One was bought at a 35% premium. We were short about $100 million worth of it. It was a lot of money, and there was $30 million down the drain, and I'd sort of pinned my career on this. And as it turns out, Royal Bank of, Charter One was worth a big round donut and was essentially closed later. And the credit losses were comical, right? This had branches in places where, when they were trying to tidy it up, the liquidators were literally scared to walk in the streets. Right? Now, places in America you don't want to walk in the streets, but there are not a lot of them. It's just Charter One Financial happened to be there. And Charter One's mortgage book wasn't bad. It was atrocious. It was as bad as anything. But I was short the stock, and it was taken out for a 30% premium before it blew up. right? And I was going through this sort of rough trot of being right and wrong. And the truth is that, you solve that with a portfolio. But as an analyst, it was a very tough place to be. You solve that with good portfolio management.
Yeah. So I think your retirement must have lasted about 1.5 years then before Bronte started.
Yeah, look, at some point or other, I was working 8 hours a day picking stocks. So I thought, fuck it, I've got to do this for a living.
And is it true you and Simon opened Bronte on the day Lehman Brothers collapsed?
We had a seeding deal organised, and we flew to America to get the seeding deal signed, and we arrived in America the day that Lehman collapsed.
Oh, okay. Right.
And so we walked around expecting people to give us money the week that Lehman collapsed. This wasn't going to happen. We refer it to our Dumb and Dumber moment. Right, but yeah, it was kind of a spectacularly bad time to try and raise money.
Yeah.
It was actually a particularly good time to start investing, but it was a hard time to raise money.
Yeah. But the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah, look, we started slow.
Yeah.
Right, we started with single-digit external millions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I remember when we got to managing $21 million one day, and I went into my wife, who was still in bed in the morning, and because I just looked at the portfolio in the morning, and it ticked over 21, and I jumped up and down, star jumping, saying 21 today, 21 today. Right, and these days, a good week swing is more than $21 million.
Yeah.
Right, but or at least a good month's swing is more than $21 million. But when we got to $21 million, it was news to us.
Yeah.
Right, starting a fund manager is, now that it's worked, I can gloat a little, but it looks a little bit like, if you look at the statistics, it looks a little bit like the triumph of hope over experience. It was a tough time.
Yeah.
All right, and it was a tough. I've since said that there are only two times to start a business. One is in your 20s and one is in your 40s. But don't do it in your 30s.
Interesting.
And the reason is, in your 20s you're too dumb to know the alternative.
Yeah.
And in your 40s you may be financially established enough to deal with the 5 years of misery that you're about to inflict on yourself. But in your 30s you have young children.
Yeah.
And 5 years of financial misery inflicted on a family with young children does not work.
Yeah.
You really want to start in your 20s or your 40s, but not in your 30s.
Yeah. We've spoken a lot about how Marc Cohodes is possibly the best stock picker in the world, but people also regard you as one of the world's greatest short sellers. And it would be rude if I didn't ask you some targeted questions.
I'm not as good at Marc Cohodes.
But you are very, very good.
I'm really not as good as Marc. But we're better at portfolio management than Marc, so our numbers are better than Marc's, right? But he is a better stock picker.
Yeah. But I do want to ask you some specific questions about the short selling technique, putting aside the portfolio management now. And the first one's sort of an easy one, a fun one, I suppose, and that is, so you short frauds, fads and failures, but mostly frauds. Characterize the sort of person, the sort of scumbag you're looking for. Paint a portrait for us.
Oh, there's different varieties.
Yeah.
But there's a broker who started his career at Stratton Oakmont, which is the firm in the Wolf of Wall Street. If you worked at Stratton Oakmont, you have demonstrated, for say a year, you have demonstrated the ability to ring people up and sell them a worthless piece of shit. This is not a trivial skill, right? Being a con man is actually a trained skill in this case, and these can be very good con men. This guy disappeared for a whole lot of time, and he's now the CFO of a biotech company. Okay, I'm shorted, almost without looking any further, right? And the reason I'm shorted is biotechs are places with vast amounts of inflated claims, which may or may not be true, but are completely untestable. But you have somebody who has demonstrated experience in ringing people up and ripping them off, and training in that. Now, that's a little bit harsh, but it's not far from the truth. Now, it doesn't work all the time either, right? For instance, there was a tell, and I'm not going to tell you what the tell was. It was a particular person who we know was associated with 11 straight frauds and no successes. Or 11 straight zeros and no successes, and some of those zeros we know to be frauds, or we thought were frauds for some other reason. Right? So we can't tell all 11 were frauds, but there were 11 straight zeros, and he's now associated with another stock, which was in this case Amarin, which is a biotech testing high purity fish oil for cardiovascular conditions. And we had our usual 30 bips short. We don't know anything about high purity fish oil and its effectiveness for cardiovascular. In fact, we knew nothing about this company at all, except that this one person was associated with them, and the one person had previously been associated with 11 zeros, at least a few of which we thought were frauds. And lo and behold, the phase 3 results come out. And the phase 3 results are very hard to fake in this case because it's decentralized doctors reporting independently to the FDA. And everything is double-blinded, including to the doctor. So the doctor doesn't know what he should be reporting. And the results weren't good, they were astonishing. This high-purity fish oil that they were testing probably has more effect on reducing heart attack than statins. And statins are the biggest drugs in human history. Right? The one that Pfizer sold, Lipitor, was a 10 billion revenue drug. Right? Crestor is a multi-billion revenue drug. And it came out of the blue. And the stock went up like 500%. As soon as we saw the results, we covered it all. It was up 350, 400%, something in that range. It cost us more than 1% of the fund. Had we had a big position, had we been 3% short, it would have been diabolical for us. We would have been down, 12, 15% in a day. Bang. And all we had was somebody who we had statistically shown was likely to be a scumbag. And we were wrong. Now, the funny thing is we've got 2 other stocks associated with that same person. So what do we do about it now?
You update in a Bayesian sense?
Well, I do, except that, it could be that the person involved is still a scumbag, and that a good company accidentally walked into the scumbag, right, and met them and hired them for some purpose. Right, in which case it could be dumb luck, good things happen to bad people. Or it could be that fish oil for heart attack was a bogus idea that that had been sampled around lots of times, and this little company picked it up, and miracle of miracle, an idea that shouldn't have worked. I don't understand the science well enough to make that assessment. Right? It could be, again, good things happen to bad people.
Yeah.
We genuinely don't know. Right, but Amarin, immediately wound up with a multi-billion market cap. And, if you put a gun to my head now, I'd say I should be long it. At 5 times the price I was once shorted. Right, so the answer is, what's my typical scumbag look like? Well, the answer is he's a recidivist.
Okay.
Right, we deal in guilt by association. Right? If you hang out with somebody who looks like a scumbag, you're probably a scumbag. Right? Now, the truth is that that's only statistically right. It's not good enough for a jury. But it works for us. Right? Now, sometimes that guilt by association, if you get 9 different associations, you can be pretty sure. Each one of them is circumstantial and probably only a 70% chance. Right? But, and some people, we know a geologist who I'm not going to name, who has never signed off on a gold deposit we think was honest. Right. Now, he lives in a jurisdiction with savage defamation laws. Right. So I'm definitely not going to name him.
Yeah.
But next time he signs off on a gold deposit, we'll probably be short it. One day he's going to be hired by a real company and we're going to lose money on it.
Yeah.
Right? But in a Bayesian sense, we know he's a scumbag.
Yeah.
Right?
So you have a database of these scumbags?
Yeah, and we've got tools, for instance, that strip the SEC database every day, run it through name recognition software company, flag people. It's not as good as I'd like, right? And it's also putting in some accounting rules and some liquidity rules, etc. It's been a lot of software development.
It sounds pretty unique.
Yeah, I don't want to tell you exactly how it's done, but the model is computerized Marc Cohodes. I just want to sort of bottle Marc, right? Because he's the best stock picker I've ever seen.
Yeah. Are all the scumbags men?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, to pick one recently, Theranos was a woman.
Yeah.
There was, I can't say it because it's in a defamation-prone country, right? I mean, if
Australia.
No, it could be UK.
Oh, I'm joking.
Right?
Yeah.
The UK
Could
is
be the
very
UK.
bad defamation.
Right.
But there was another one that I can think of that was associated with a Saudi arms dealer, but a woman. Right. And she had a company with a $500 million market cap that ceased to exist.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's fair to say that most of the scumbags are men. Right? There are other groups, I mean, men are clearly overrepresented, and by a lot. There are other groups that are overrepresented, the most unlikely of which is Mormons.
This is interesting.
Right? And, Mormons are 2% of the US population and about 6% of Fortune 500 CEOs. Right? And almost all of those Fortune 500 CEOs came up through a sales function. Mormons are pound for pound the best sellers in the world. And the reason is obvious as hell, which is that if you're 19 and you go missionary, right, because they all go out and be missionaries, what is being a missionary? It's selling religion door to door. And in this case, it's selling a pretty weird religion door to door. If you can sell religion door to door, you can sell anything.
Yeah.
It's like the best training for a sales job that ever existed. So it turns out that if I were hiring salespeople in America that had a job where, say, the rejection rate was 95%, right? Because, having the ability to ring people up and just have them be rude to you and then hang up and then do it again and 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 not take it emotionally. That's hard. I couldn't do it. Right? I'm too emotional a guy. I don't like rejection. But, if you're a Mormon that sold religion door to door for 2 years, you know how to do that.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out that if I was hiring, sales force for zero in America, my sales force would be 30% Mormon. Right? And the reason it'd be 30% Mormon is just they know how to do that. They were trained when they were 19. And if you look at Fortune 500s, 2% of America are Mormons, 6% of Fortune 500 CEOs is the number I've always heard. Right? They all came up through the sales function. They're pound for pound the best sellers in human history.
And what % dodgy frauds?
Probably 10.
Wow.
Right? And the reason is that if you're going...
Dodgy frauds in America? Anyway.
Yeah, dodgy frauds in America.
Okay.
Right? And the reason is that if you've got a dodgy fraud, right, and, selling a fraud has a 100% margin. Right? You just steal the money.
Yeah.
Right? If you're doing something with a 100% margin and you get 40 rejections and 1 acceptance, that's a great hit rate.
Yeah.
That's a really great hit rate. You'll get rich off that.
Yeah.
Right?
Because the gross margin is 100%.
You're trained for it, right? Being a missionary is absolute perfect training for being a scumbag later. It's also good training for being a zero salesman. I mean, I've tried to encourage Zero to hire Mormons in America. Right? And the reason is that I think they do better with their Mormons than they're doing with their current sales force. They're cheaper and they're based in Salt Lake City, which is cheaper than Silicon Valley. Right? It's not that if you train people to sell stuff, guess what? They'll sell stuff.
Yep.
For good and for evil.
Yep. So I think you've seen this before. I'm just going to show you this again.
No, I hope that wasn't too politically incorrect. But
No,
it was
not at all.
Oh, what the Bernie Madoff account?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, right, yes.
Can you just explain that to people? And does stuff like that ever figure into your thinking when you're trying to track down frauds? Do you go into that sort of background information?
That's one that I would really, really love to do. These are Bernie Madoff's golf scores.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read a string of them. 87, 86, 85, 83, 85, 83, 85, 84, 89, 84, 86, 85, 80, 82, 87, 84, 84, 84, 86, 84. Now, nobody is that consistent at golf.
Yep.
Tiger Woods is nowhere near that consistent at golf.
And those are actually Bernie Madoff's golf scores.
They are actually Bernie Madoff's golf scores, and they're a public database of golf scores. And there are people who have tried to work out how many weekends a CEO is playing golf, right? But there is absolutely no way they were his golf scores. He just made them up, right? They were a fraud. And if somebody's faking their golf scores, they're probably faking other things. They just don't have any morality. I wish I'd known. So no, we haven't done it. But there is a public database of people's golf scores. And yeah, I'd love to actually raid the whole database and work out systematically who is faking their golf scores and short their stocks.
Yeah.
It would work. Right? It's another source of data. Please don't give all my ideas away. I've never done that one. Right, I know I published it, but, yada, 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 86, 86, 84, consistent returns, no volatility. We know the story.
It's kind of cute.
It's really cute. It's a good fraud.
I want to ask you about the Chinese species of frauds right now, because I think that's very interesting, and it figures in Bronte's story. So in your June 2011 client letter, you wrote that, quote, by October last year, we were pretty sure that, to a reasonable approximation, every reverse merger Chinese stock in North America is a fraud, end quote. That's just extraordinary.
It was extraordinary, but that was also the state of play.
Right.
My favourite version of this is Sino-Forest. Sino-Forest was originally, although everyone forgot it, a reverse merger forestry company in Canada. If you go back to the first accounts, it's actually obvious it's a fraud. Right? And the reason it's obvious is you go look for the property, plant and equipment line, and there wasn't one. Right? There was a property line, it was all forests. Yeah. Right? But you run a forestry operation, you must own a car. Right? A four-wheel drive somewhere. At least. You must own a chainsaw.
Yeah.
Right? Because trees fall across roads. There are certain basic equipment that you have to have. The accounts literally failed any simple smell test. But in those days, it was a $50 million company, and who cared, or a $100 million company, and who cared, right? It was just another penny stock reverse merger fraud. They got more sophisticated over time, and by the time it ended, the accounts looked real enough, right? That is, you had to be a real sophisticate to smell that they were wrong. But at the end of it, Sino-Forest was a $7 billion company where insiders had sold over $1 billion worth of shares, and which had borrowed $2 billion in the Hong Kong market to buy forests. And as far as I can tell, there was never more than about 15,000 hectares of forest. They claimed that there was 875,000 hectares. It became known in short seller circles as Sino-Forest. Now, the thing that amazes me about Sino-Forest is that they borrowed $2 billion in the Hong Kong market to invest in forest, and there was no forest. So that $2 billion went into somebody's pocket. Now, this isn't a small theft. This isn't, 20 million here. We sort of have a big political scandal in Australia about $80 million paid in water rights to some suspicious-looking Cayman Island company. And we don't know all the facts, but that's what it looks like. This was $2 billion.
Yeah, I'm now on the rich list fraud.
This is an amount that puts you on the world list of richest people.
Yeah.
Now, I've always looked for Alan Chan to be on the Forbes Global Billionaires list, but he's not there. And the source of wealth, Alan Chan is the old CEO of Sino-Forest. And the source of wealth should read stock fraud. He's not there. That said, no one was ever punished in China. No one went to jail. No one was arrested. The $2 billion was never tracked down. It's China, so I presume that Alan Chan doesn't have all of the $2 billion. He had to pay it to people up the line, and some of it went all the way up the corrupt Chinese hierarchy. Otherwise, somebody might have gone to jail. But no one went to jail. Now, if the penalty for blatantly stealing $2 billion is that you get to keep $2 billion, or you get to keep $500 million, and there's no other penalty, even after it's exposed, then guess what will happen? The answer is people will do it. Now, there's a second thing that's going on here, which is it was illegal and still is illegal for most small businessmen to take money out of China. If I have a small widget company, let's pick one, it makes organic fertilizer, right? If I were to list that in China, I would have renminbi. If I were to list it in the United States, I would have US dollars. Functionally, by listing the business in the United States, I've taken money out of China. That's normally illegal. So in order to get your functional business listed in the US, you have to have broken the law or bribed someone so that the law doesn't apply to you. Now I look at 100 companies that are small companies doing things like making bromine or making concentrated fruit juice, Sky People fruit juice, or making making organic fertilizer, China Agrotech, or doing software for banks, Longtop. Every one of them is listed outside China, and every one of them is presumably run by people who have either broken the law or the law doesn't apply to them. So that's your starting point, right? At a reasonable approximation, most of them are going to be frauds. And most of them were.
Put some dates on this for us, the China fraud era.
Well,
as they call it.
I think the China fraud era is now.
Right.
Right? That is, I don't think anything has fundamentally changed except the market perception of these companies.
Well, when did it begin, at least?
Well, I think right from the moment that there were Chinese companies listing in America, there were fraudulent Chinese companies listing in America.
Okay.
And there are still fraudulent Chinese companies listing in America. And some of them blow up every now and again. There was one Yangtze River Logistics company which has blown up recently, but has gone from a multi-billion market cap to token amounts, and it's still got 200 million market cap, and I'd short it, except the borrow cost is 190%. Right, so I can't short it. But there are plenty of them.
Yeah.
Right. There was a particular period in 2011 when they were exposed. And the reason was that was before the Chinese. There was a period there where some of them were incredibly blatant. And some were so blatant that you could prove they were a fraud without leaving your desk. My favourite one was one called Universal Travel, which was sort of a travel.com for China. And I tried to buy an air ticket on it, and I proved that it couldn't. And then I managed to show that they were listing tickets for a Grand Prix that had occurred 2 years prior.
Right.
Right? And all they'd done is stolen a website from somebody else, but none of the back end worked.
Yeah.
The whole thing was fictional. Right? And it had a market cap of sort of 700 million and was just completely made up. And the beauty of that one wasn't that it was a fraud. It was a fraud that you could prove was a fraud without leaving your desk.
Well, that brings me to another question. I read in your May 2011 client letter, you said that Chinese frauds are the richest vein of non-market correlated profit Bronte has ever discovered. When we started, John could read the accounts of a reverse takeover stock and within 20 minutes determine it was a fraud.
Oh, yeah. So some of these were just really silly.
But what were some of the other techniques?
I'll give you an example. There was one called, there was one that made bromine. I mentioned it earlier, and I can't even remember the name of the stock. But it turned over its inventory 180 times a year. Right? The inventory number was incredibly low relative to COGS. Right? So cost of goods sold was 180 times static inventory. Now, there's a bromine maker in America which had gone private. Right, got been taken out by private equity or something before that, called Great Lakes Chemical. It made exactly the same products, and it turned over its inventory 5 times a year. And then you think of the physical process of making bromine, which involved treating and drying out brine, and once you got it, it was extremely reactive and dangerous, right? And there's another, and the physical process couldn't be done in 2 days. It took weeks. Right, so it's not physically possible to turn the trading stock over 180 times a year. Right, so we knew it was a fraud without looking. Now, somebody later went and photographed their plant and proved it was a fraud and went public, but we were shorted before that, and we were shorted on a 5-minute look. And it was time and time again you could see this. Retailers with large receivables was another one. Fake receivables was a surprisingly common one. Have you heard my fake receivable story?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
I'll tell you my fake receivable story. And
is it a Chinese story?
No, it's not. It's an English one. But the example was retailers that were owed a lot of money. Now, there's no way that you can owe money to a retailer unless it has a lay-by business, right? Because you go in with your cash or your credit card, you pull out money. If it's credit card, it's 2 days of turnover. So that, the receivables should be 2 days of sales because, the bank pays them in 2 days. If the year end is on a weekend, it might be 3 or 4 days of sales. But it's not 20 days of sales. Right? So when you saw a retailer with a large receivable, you knew the accounts were made up. Now, my favourite receivable story is a company called Cupid PLC, which was listed in the UK. And they did threaten to sue me when I went public over this, but they're long gone, so I think I can say this safely.
When was this?
6 or 7 years ago. Cupid was a roll-up of dating sites. And it used to, its biggest site by advertising was Girls Date for Free. And the model was that girls could sign up, didn't cost them anything, they could talk to anyone, didn't cost them anything, or hence lots of girls there, right? But boys had to pay. So when you wanted to talk to someone, you had to fork out. If you looked at the Alexa data, which isn't worth very much, there wasn't much traffic on that site. They also owned one that's still around called Uniform Dating, which tries to set girls up with firemen. Right? Uniform dating. But it turned out that the only site that they had that had any traffic were various adult sites, of which the best known one was one called Be Naughty. And Be Naughty, according to was designed to set you up with women that wanted to cheat on their husbands. And hence it was sort of a girls' date for free thing too. And it turns out that Be Naughty only had traffic in Australia, England, India and South Africa. So I don't understand why these countries are full of men that wanted to cheat on their husbands. And according to the Alexa data, the traffic was about 95% male, and I would be very surprised if it weren't 99.9% male, because it was, the equivalent of Ashley Madison. But it was an internet dating company, and this internet dating company had a balance sheet that looked like £30 million of goodwill because it was a roll-up, £10 million of property, plant and equipment, £10 million of receivables, and about £60 million of sales. Fat margin sales because it's, online internet dating. And I shorted it without looking any further. And the reason I shorted it without looking any further is I can't work out how you can owe money to it. right? Because you pay for a credit card up front. The only receivables it should have are 2 days of wash, and it had like 2 months of receivables. And so I assumed the accounts were fake, which wasn't a bad assumption. So I shorted it, and then the stock went up. And then went up a bit further. So I got a bit annoyed, and I did some research. And doing some research essentially meant asking my wife's permission to join a bunch of adult dating sites. This is an interesting conversation. My wife looked at me as if I was completely weird.
She believed you that it was for research?
She did, but the solution was that I gave her all the logins.
Oh, that's good.
And I let her help write the profiles.
Yeah.
And we did fake male profiles and fake female profiles and all sorts of things. But the most ridiculous profile was the most unattractive male we could think of. And this was actually partly written by my wife. So, she's got the sense of humour, not me. But I was a 280 kilo or 620 pound computer programmer. I used to have a good job, but I couldn't walk from office to office anymore. So I now have a less good job, and I work from home. And my mum feeds me my favourite food, which is pizza. Now, I'm on internet dating because my mum is sick. She's also obese, and she's not able to look after me very much. So I now need somebody to help look after me. Now, one of the questions was, what's your most unusual feature? And I said, well, some people say it's my body odour, but it's not, it's my eyes, right? They're sort of pink and strangely beautiful. And the pink eyes, it turns out, were a symptom of my untreated gonorrhea, which infected both my rectal and urinary passages, right? It also accounted for my bad smell because I leaked a mixture of pus and fecal matter. Right. And I just left this profile up, and I got about 40 age-appropriate women wanting to talk to me.
Maybe they were all thinking, this guy has a great sense of humour. He's being so ironic.
At this point, I worked out pretty firmly that the women were fake.
Right.
And then just to prove that the women were fake, this was a Scottish-listed company, so I decided I'd go find the least populous spot in Scotland, which turns out to be an island in the Shetland Islands called Stosa Spur. And you won't know where Stosa Spur is. I probably know more about Stosa Spur because I actually tried to work out what the population was and their age. There are 8 of them, 5 men, 3 women. So I started inventing fake profiles that lived on Stosa Spur. And I discovered all these women on Stosa Spur who wanted to cheat on their husbands. And so I was going to blog about this. I never did, but I was going to talk about the randy women of Stosa Spur. Put out all the fake... right? And you know what it is. It was a device for separating people from their money.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the original business model was we set up fake profiles, the women interact with the men hand over their credit card, and then lo and behold, the Russian mafia 3 months later strip your credit card of all its money.
Right.
And then that didn't work, so they just listed it. And, the next set of victims is the people who buy Scottish stocks. I don't know, right? But, all of that was fun and games. The real tell was that it had 10 million pounds of receivables. It was 9.6 million pounds if you really wish to go look. But, it's kind of odd that I remember the balance sheet 7 years later.
Yeah.
That's sort of part and parcel of it. The question of, how do you tell by just looking? The answer is it's just sort of goddamn obvious if you think about it. It shouldn't have receivables. It shouldn't turn its trading stock 180 times a year, right? The balance sheet makes no sense. Now, there are companies for which the balance sheet makes no sense, but I can't prove they're a fraud and they have real businesses. Like, if somebody thinks that they understand the balance sheet of Alibaba, which is a $200 billion company, I'd fire them. Right? You just can't understand it.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that is that there's real stuff in there and fake stuff in there. And
in Alibaba's balance sheet.
In Alibaba's accounts, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do about it. I mean, the Charlie Munger slogan applies, I think, which is that if you mix turds and raisins, they're still turds. Right? And Alibaba, I think, is an example of turds and raisins. There are plenty of good raisins in there, though. So, I'm wary about the short. They're normally short turds.
So, what do you think goes through the mind of someone like the Cupid CEO or whoever was listing it when the fraud is just that blatantly obvious?
Nobody was prosecuted. They
Right.
sold a lot of stock. They made
Right.
a lot of money.
Okay, so it's pretty rational.
Yeah, it's entirely rational.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as blatant as Sino-Forest.
Mm.
I mean, in the Cupid case, Cupid PLC case, there
Right.
really was an online dating business, and it really did have some revenue, right? And I don't know how much revenue. I know the accounts didn't make any sense, right? In other words, it was some raisins and a lot of turds.
Mm-hmm.
And it never got too big, right? It never got... Whereas, if you had done Sino-Forest in the UK, right, with UK citizens, somebody would have been prosecuted, somebody would have gone to jail.
Yeah.
If you'd done it in Australia even, and, ASIC is possibly the weakest securities regulator in the Western world outside Canada, right? Although there's some pretty strict competition here,
Yeah.
right? But if you'd done it in Australia, somebody would have gone to jail.
Yeah.
Right? If you had done it in China, he steals 2 billion. The penalties, he gets to keep $500 million. Right? He's still a rich guy. No penalty.
So Cupid PLC is a good example of how you can use a few heuristics to quickly determine whether something's a fraud.
Yeah, you just think through the business and
Yeah.
does the business match the balance sheet?
Yeah. And this happened a lot with the Chinese frauds.
All over the place.
Yeah.
They were just sloppy.
So for a while there, 2010, 2011, for Bronte it was like shooting fish in a barrel. But at some point in Bronte's history, there was a point of inflection where they became a lot harder to knock off. Tell us about that.
I don't think they became any less fraudulent. Right? Maybe the most blatant ones disappeared. The ones that you could prove were frauds without leaving your desk had basically all gone.
Yeah.
The ones that were left were difficult frauds. And because they were difficult frauds, and some of them turned into real companies too. So, one of the exits for a fraud is that you use your high stock price to buy something.
Fake it till you make it.
Fake it till you make it.
Right.
And some of these companies turned real.
Yeah.
Right. But we were overextended in this. We had about 40% or 45% of the book short Chinese frauds.
Yeah.
And there was a single month where they went up 20%, all of them across the board.
Yeah.
And we went down 8 on those. Right. And in fact, there are sort of 2 bad-ish months in here. There's a bad month that you can't see in our returns because it was July. It happened intra-month. So we were up a long way halfway through July, gave it all back and then a little bit,
Yeah.
and then a lot more and then won it back. But the result of which is you see 2 mostly
out.
flat months.
Right.
But in fact, there was a pretty gargantuan swing in there. And that swing caused us to take an awful lot of risk off. Right, because we just looked at it and said, we're too far out here and weird things can happen. And then there was another month in January 2012, and we've written about that month extensively. And if you read our letters from January to about June, we talk about all the changes we have in the portfolio to manage the risk. But the changes that we have in the portfolio increased the number of shorts and increased the diversity and decreased their size. And that was when we decided that computerized Marc Cohodes was inevitable. It was the only way that we could manage this bucking bronco of a portfolio that we'd created. We just had to stop it bucking by diversifying it. And to diversify it to the degree we wanted, we needed computers. So that was sort of a very big intellectual change in the way we ran Bronte.
But what do you think changed in the environment in China?
No idea.
Right.
No idea at all. Well, at least one thing changed, which is that some of the frauds that were left had associations with the ruling parties.
Right.
And the ones that didn't have associations were also the ones that busted.
Okay.
Right? So that the politics of knocking them over changed.
Huh.
But it was only after the event years later that I realised that in some cases the beneficiary was the child of somebody who, or the grandchild of somebody who fought alongside Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
But being the grandchild of somebody who fought alongside Chairman Mao was a license to commit fraud.
Yeah.
I only worked out the relationships years later. When it happened, we had no idea what had changed. We just looked at the environment and said, this has changed, and it's changed in ways that could hurt us. We need to be more careful.
Yeah.
And we're cognizant of all the ways that you can lose money, and we decided we'd be more careful. And fundamentally, we didn't lose money. We produced a single month with -6 in it, but we didn't really lose money, right? If you're producing 10 and 20% months and then you produce a -6, nobody's going to complain.
Yeah.
Nobody did, but we did. We looked at it and said, we've got to change our risk profile fast. And we did.
Changing to another story now, you became quite famous for shorting the drug company Valeant, and we're not going to rehash that story because it's so well portrayed in the Netflix Dirty Money episode Drug Short, for people who want to check that out. But there's one little story about it that I want to share with people who might not be diligent readers of your blog, and that's the story of how you came across it, because I think it's really neat.
Look, it actually flagged lots of ways.
Okay.
Valeant, we flag bad people.
Yeah.
Inside Valeant, there were a lot of bad people, right? Some of them are only bad circumstantially. But the best one was a woman called Norma Provencio, who was the chair of the audit committee, and she had previously been the chair of an audit committee of a company called Hartronic Signalife. Mm-hmm. And the CEO and co-founder of Hartronic Signalife is currently in the federal pen for 12 years. And this is a pretty big red flag. Mm-hmm. It's not a red flag that says, I'm going to short the stock. And in fact, I'm not even sure that Norma Provencio is guilty or not. Right? I just know that she was associated with a fraud because that's what we do. But that was enough to make us dig and dig and dig and dig and dig. And then within days, there were 25 other red flags.
Right.
It didn't take but red flag number one was people.
Interesting.
It's almost always people.
Okay. Well, I want to ask about one red flag in particular that's just about
that table.
Numbers. Yeah.
The number thing was a proof.
Because this is really
There was
interesting.
a table in Bill Ackman's slideshow telling you about why you should buy Valeant.
Yeah.
And this table came from another slideshow which was presented by Valeant. And Valeant had about 200 drugs, and it wanted to tell you that the drugs were highly diversified. And it told us our top 10 drugs are 18% of sales. And our next 10 drugs are 12% of sales. And from the moment I saw that table, I knew it must be a fraud. And the reason is that the top drugs, to be 18% of sales, they have to average 1.8. Mm-hmm. And the next 10 drugs to be 12% of sales have to average next 1.2. So you've got to manage to fit 20 drugs or so between 1.2% of sales and 1.8% of sales, and none of them have got to be big enough that they take the thing out. So a single drug at 3% of sales tends to stuff you. Sit down with a spreadsheet and try it. You cannot randomly construct the numbers. In fact, the mathematical rules about it are so tight that they have to be spaced almost dead evenly to make it work. Right? So, most things are distributed with lumps and tails and a power rule and things like that. No statistical distribution looks like that. And in fact, the distribution is so tightly constrained that we thought it was impossible. Then we found some evidence that one drug is at least 3% of sales, and then we knew it was completely cactus.
Yeah.
Right? But that single table was enough to prove that they were lying in their numbers. Now, once you've caught them lying once, you've got a problem, which is that the truth refers to one state only and lies refer to a multitude, and you've proved they're lying. And now they've told you 50 other things, and some of them might be true and some might be lies, but you have no idea which. We found a lot more lies later. But all you needed to do, a lot of that has the feeling of Marc Cohodes, welcome to proof number 28. We had
Yeah.
proof number 1.
Yeah.
It was fine. Right? We had a bad director, 2 or 3 other bad people, and a proof of lies about numbers. Short it. You don't need any more. Now, the reason we did a lot more, and it's well told in that documentary, was that we were being very public about it. And this was a $100 billion company, and shorting a $100 billion company saying it's a fraud. This was my learn out in Houseby. I had to be a bit loud. Right? And I'm proud of it too, in the same way that Mark's proud of learn out in Houseby. I made more money on it than Mark did. But even then people look at it and say, why didn't you make more money? Right? Why didn't you make 20-30% of the portfolio? You knew it's the biggest fraud in the world.
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, Mark found the biggest fraud in the world and it almost destroyed him by being oversized. Right? We weren't going to make that mistake.
John, let me finally come to the morality of short selling. And I want to read a couple of paragraphs from your March 2010 client letter when you shorted a company called First Solar, which had come up with a radical new way to manufacture solar cells. And I'll quote...
That was the least moral short ever. Mostly we short scumbags.
Yeah.
And what we do is dilute the profits of scumbags.
Yeah.
First Solar was a really, really good company that was on the wrong side of history.
Right.
And the reason it was on the wrong side of history was that the Chinese worked out how to make cheaper solar cells. And so you had this wonderful technology that was suddenly out of the money, and it was pretty clear that it was... And the short worked fine, right? But it didn't go to zero, and it didn't deserve to go to zero. It was run by people who, if they wanted to marry your daughter, you would be thrilled. And I felt slightly dirty shorting it. Right? And the reason I felt slightly dirty was this is a good company. We don't short good companies normally. Partly I wrote it up because it was such a good company that I felt bad and I thought my clients should know.
Yeah.
Right?
That you could divorce yourself from your emotions like that.
Look, my clients pay me to make money.
Yeah.
Right? I don't want to forget the first job. Right? But mostly making money, sometimes making money might involve buying an Indonesian tobacco stock that cuts down rainforest to smoke cure tobacco so they can addict young children. And maybe I'm not very comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And sometimes making money means shorting one of the greatest technology successes I've ever seen, which was First Solar. And I'm also not very comfortable with that. And generally, that's not what we do. Right?
Yep.
We short low quality companies run by scumbags, and we go long companies that are really well managed, good businesses run by people you'd have marry your daughter. And I'm actually happy with that.
Yeah.
But I'm not committed to it. My first job is to make money.
Yeah. Now, I understand that First Solar isn't the typical company you short, but just let me quote from the letter because I think it opens up an interesting question. So this is just a couple of paragraphs that you and or Simon wrote back in 2010. So, quote, "We do not wish failure on First Solar, and if we are right, it could not have happened to a nicer company, no irony intended. Capitalism is not fair, and technology investment is particularly unfair. We don't make money from fairness. We make money from getting the business analysis right and betting on or against the right business. And in this case, we're betting against the most successful company in a massively important growth industry. If we are right, and we think we are, then we will make money from the demise of a company that has much improved the world. We like to think our business is noble. And it is sometimes. But in this case, we can see why people dislike short sellers. Their opinion, however, is not our business."
That's exactly right. Right? This was one, it is the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
Right? Mostly bad companies fail and good companies succeed. But every now and again, a good company is on the wrong side of history. First Solar was a company that invented a new way of making solar cells. It was world beating for a while, and then the Chinese made something cheaper. And it was a good company, and its massive success went away. And sometimes bad companies succeed, right? An Indonesian tobacco company that cuts down rainforest to smoke cure tobacco to addict to young children is a bad company. but it makes a shitload of money.
Yeah.
It's not, capitalism isn't fair, right? Capitalism gives money. I mean, some people just born with skills that make more money. Some people happen to be in the right niches. Some businesses are just abnormally profitable for decades, right? And not through any particular moral advantage of the owners, but just because they're in the right place at the right time. Careers involve a lot of luck. If I hadn't sat next to that woman on the ferry, I'd have probably spent out my life as a mid-ranking public servant, right? And was it fair that I had that luck of sitting next to the right person on the ferry? No, I was just in the right place at the right time. And I admittedly, I'd worked hard and I was, well prepared for a random job interview, and it all worked very nicely. And if I'd been poorly prepared, I would have been burnt off in 5 minutes too. But if you don't acknowledge that the world involves some capricious luck and some capricious failures, you're actually analysing it wrong. Now, mostly bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. But it's not entirely true. Sometimes good things happen to bad people, and sometimes good things happen to bad people that wear short and we lose money.
But I want to help you out here because...
I acknowledge it. I felt sick about shorting that. I still feel sick about shorting that.
But from a utilitarian perspective, is it really immoral? Because what you're doing is you're only taking an interest in the demise of the company, but you're not actively bringing that about.
No, I'm also reducing their access to capital markets.
Okay, right.
Because as I bid down the stock price a little bit, incrementally capital becomes more expensive.
Right. So you are having some counterfactual impact.
I'm having some counterfactual effect. Yes.
Okay, right.
Moreover, I went public on it, which probably decreased their access to stock markets even further. Right. I was no hero.
Yeah. Is Tesla in this category or in a different category?
Tesla was in this category and has moved to a different category.
Something darker.
Yeah. Tesla, you have to give Elon credit for something. Elon proved that internal combustion engines with computer-controlled batteries could be better in almost every respect. Electronic engines with computer-controlled batteries could be better in every respect than an internal combustion engine. And in 25 years' time, I'm pretty sure that most cars sold will be electric and that most of the power generated for them will be solar. And in that process, we will have improved the world dramatically. Not a little bit, but dramatically. We will have taken greenhouse gases out. And Elon Musk will go down as a hero in that respect. And, there's a Star Trek episode where somebody's asked how they want to be remembered, and they talk about the Wright brothers, Elon Musk and Zefram Cochrane. And Zefram Cochrane invented warp drive, if you're a Star Trekker, right? And Elon Musk doesn't belong there, but nonetheless, it's kind of amusing. That said, Elon didn't solve another problem, which is how do you mass market manufacture something as complicated as an automobile really cheaply and really accurately? And Toyota knows how to do that. It's 40, 50 years of development. Right? And Volkswagen know how to do that. Volkswagen make dirty, polluting engines. I drive a dirty diesel. Right? But they sure as hell know how to manufacture well.
Yeah.
And Elon is behind the 8 ball because it will be easier for Volkswagen to copy Elon's technology than it is for Elon to catch up with Volkswagen's manufacturing prowess. Moreover, the lack of manufacturing prowess meant that Elon could never deliver the $35,000 car, and he never has. Right? He's put himself in a market somewhat above, mid-range BMWs. He's just in a luxury car market. He's actually the biggest player. He's got maintenance warranties misaccounted up the wazoo, and he's saturated his market. He's then overpromised. I mean, he's promised things about self-drive that just are not true. And he's promised things about ability to deliver cars at certain prices that are not true. And the company has burnt a lot of cash. And as it gets later and later in the piece, the disconnect between what Elon promises and the reality on the ground just widens and widens and widens. And, that's not actually unusual in the late stage of a failure, right? His entire being is around this thing, and he's got to protect it. And, one way of protecting it is to make sure that the stock price stays high. There's a second problem, which is that he has margin loans. And those margin loans are not small, they're billions of dollars. And if the stock tips below the strike price of the margin loans, they'll be forced selling, and that could be nasty. And so not only does he have to keep, the story rolling, but he has to keep the stock price above the margin loan. And there's a very big disconnect between what Elon says and what can actually be measured. And, there are famous examples like, his solar roof tiles. When he bought Solar City, he pitched this idea of, solar cells in the shape of roof tiles, and 3 years later, we've not seen them. His self-drive claims are pretty dodgy, and there are lots of videos of people having self-drive cars that misbehave badly. People have been compiling statistics of people who have died with his self-drive cars. I don't know whether, they would have died at a higher rate with self-drive on and self-drive off. My guess is it's higher with self-drive on, but I really don't know. But the claims don't match. Right? Self-drive, for instance, has just been oversold. And I sort of regard Elon as once pure raisins and now turds mixed with raisins. And I think the end game for turds mixed with raisins is still turds. Mm-hmm. And I'm short it in small quantity because it has red flags all over the place. But I still feel a little guilty about it, right? Because, this isn't shorting Valeant, which was just an evil company, or even Mattel, which is an evil company. The toy company kills children.
30-something babies in the US.
Yes, all right. But this is more like shorting First Solar with Darth Vader in charge. I'm not so upset about it as I was shorting First Solar. But I still wish he'd succeed, and he won't. I'm shorting because my job's to make money, not to wish he'd succeed.
Just finally, someone asked me to ask you how you structure your days. I know you
don't, as a general rule. Okay, days of the week. I have a beach house.
Yeah.
And I tend to try and spend Monday and Friday at the beach house. In the old days, this worked really well because my wife lived in Sydney all the time, and she'd come up to the beach house on Saturday lunchtime. So I would have all of Friday and all of Monday and half of Saturday alone. And I worked and worked and worked and worked and worked like a Trojan. Right? There's just vast, that was where my reading was done. I had 30 hours of unconstructed time that I could just read. I might make a few phone calls, but that was it. My day then was read something, go to the beach. Read something, have lunch. Read something, go to the beach. Read something, watch a little bit of TV. Read something, go to bed. And that was incredibly productive. And now my wife lives largely at the beach house because my son has left school. And it's almost like I want to buy a beach house again, somewhere a kilometre or two away so that I can have my unconstructed time back.
Yeah.
Work is very constrained. Tuesday mornings is portfolio meetings. Thursday mornings is idea meetings. There's usually a bunch of Tuesday, Wednesday nights are almost always talking to European companies. Thursday mornings are almost always talking to American companies. We've hired a wonderful woman called Kate Pike who organises phone meetings for us all day. If any other fund managers need her, she's only working for us 1 day a week. I am going to utterly recommend her. It will change your life, I swear. Right, it's a job for a fund manager, but, you know, really good product. But even then, you know, my day is not that structured. Right. It's just I'm in the office.
So do you think the idea generation comes from that unconstructed time where your mind can wander?
No, the mistakes come from the unconstructed.
Right.
No, serious. I joke a little bit about that. But no, there's no idea generation as such.
Yeah.
Right? There's, on the short side, we've systemized it. Right? You know, follow bad people, work out where they pop up. The idea generation is computerized Marc Cohodes.
Yeah.
On the long side, most of the ideas come by dumb luck. Right? You're reading. I'll give you an example where long a company called Corbion, a company on which I have some doubts. Right? Stock's not performing particularly well. It hasn't cost us money. One of its products is algae that is particularly rich in DHA and omega fatty acids. Now, the reason you use this is that to farm salmon, you normally have to catch some wild fish, right, so that they get their fatty acids. And it used to be sort of 1.5 kilos of wild fish to produce 1 kilo of farmed fish. And we're down to the other way around. We're now down to 0.5 kilo of wild fish to produce 1 kilo of farmed fish. The rest of the food is largely things like soybean protein isolate made into a pellet. But the problem with soybean protein isolate is it misses lots of nutrients that go into the fish feed. And one of those nutrients is these algae that are rich in omega-3. The idea is you grow the omega-3 by feeding algae sugar rather than go plunder the Southern Ocean for krill.
It's a cool idea.
Now, it's a cool idea and it should make a lot of money. And the reason it should make a lot of money is it's a very small part of a big food process, and a little bit of algae allows you to displace a lot of fish and replace it with soy protein isolate, which is cheap. So it should be highly profitable, but it's not really. Now, there's a very big listed fish food factory in Denmark, which makes about 30 or 40% of the fish food for farmed salmon in Norway or in Scandinavia. And we've organised a phone call with them. And we're organising it because we want to check up on Corbion. Right? But in the process, we're going to try and check up on every other additive for fish feed. And your ideal additive is something that is hard to reproduce, is a very small part of the process, but is critical in replacing a lot of value. So if, you know, there were only one algae maker and you only needed a few grams of algae per ton of fish feed, right, then you could charge a lot of money for the algae and then you'd be very profitable. We haven't found the ideal additive. We don't know whether we will find the ideal additive. But in my dream world, there's a small company somewhere with a market cap of 200 million that has an additive that's, right, because fish farming globally is a huge business, that will have an additive that takes 5% out of the cost of fish feed globally and can charge astronomical sums and scale the business forever. Will we find this business? No. Will I find it by reading? No. Will I find it by reading and talking to the Danish company? Maybe. Do I know what I'm looking for? You betcha, right? And then you betcha because I know models of businesses that work.
Right.
And I'm going back to the question, what's it got? And I sort of idealize what it's got is a small part of a big thing that you can charge a lot of money for.
Mm-hmm. So the idea doesn't come to you, you know, when you're in the waves and you see a salmon or something.
No.
It comes, what you need comes through the calls and the reading.
Yeah. You read so you're prepped for the calls.
Yeah.
And the calls give you reading to do.
Right.
Right? It's an iterative process.
Yeah.
And the weirdest thing is I could work on this for months and months and find nothing. Or I could find something on the first call. I have no idea.
Wow. Well, this has been so interesting, and it's been a trove of value and information for everyone listening. Just before we wrap up, for the young investors in the crowd, the retail investors, maybe especially people who don't have strong finance backgrounds yet, but want to break into the industry, is there anything we've left on the table? Any advice we haven't mentioned?
Look, if you're a young investor, 10 companies that do a small but important part of the big process, where you've just gone and checked it out, riches in niches, diversified into 10, and with balance sheets that are not levered, will do you just fine for a portfolio. Do that, you will outperform the market. It's hard to do, right? If you do it well, you'll have 3 really good ideas for the first time you get an interview, right? Because one of the questions is, give me your 3 best ideas. Right. If you do it without leverage, you'll stay around for tomorrow. If you do it with leverage, good luck to you. Just take the leverage off once you're rich enough. Right. As for getting interviews, think like a businessman. Right. If you're going to be a stock picker, what is it about this business? What's it got? Kerr's question is a really good question. What's it got? What is it about this business that's special that makes me want to own it in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And if you can't answer that question, next stock, please. Right? Now, as for short selling, don't try to be Marc Cohodes. I promise you it's really hard. And Kerr made more money than Marc. It's the right side of the trade is long. And I'm short seller saying that. The right side of the trade is almost always long. Long quality. And quality in this case is, I got a small niche, I can make a lot of money out of it. Right? And, I'm sort of puzzled as to why this algae doesn't make money, but I'm going to work it out.
Well, John Hempton, we wish you all the best with that. Thanks so much for joining me.
Bye for now.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. 3 quick things before you go. Firstly, for show notes and links to everything discussed in that conversation, you can find those on my website, josephnoelwalker.com. That's my full name, JosephNoelwalker.com. Secondly, if you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @JosephNWalker. And finally,